Brothers of Cooper Ranch. Book 2. The Rancher's Unexpected Baby. Chapter 1. Surprised as hell to see you here, Mr. Cooper. Maxwell Cooper was some circle of hell less surprised to turn and find Louis Lowry leaning over the stall door. His former stable hand grinned, and the stalk of alfalfa wagged between his teeth. Slow season? Did Henderson hire you on so you could make some extra dough? Louis inquired. The other man all but batted his eyes. He knew damn well what the answer was. I'm here volunteering. Maxwell chuckled, stabbed a pile of soiled straw, and flung it into the wheelbarrow beside him. He knew Louis was just making conversation, and likely avoiding whatever chore he was getting paid to do out in the barn. Girl Scouts coming tomorrow. I heard through the grapevine that Mrs. Henderson needed extra help cleaning the barn. Can't imagine why, he thought with another glance Louis's way. The other man was examining a dirt-encrusted split in his knuckles. Louis could at least pretend to work while he's out here. He's not even wearing gloves. Gotta admire his commitment to spurning commitment. Maxwell wore gloves, but he had shed his shirt a half-hour back. Beads of sweat coasted down his back as he flexed forward to spear another shovel. You're here to help out Mrs. Henderson? Louis repeated, and his voice was loaded with innuendo. You know, the thing I hear said most around here is that the way to Dan Henderson's heart is through his wife. And there were Maxwell's motives laid bare. Used to be he occupied a permanent spot in his neighbor's heart. He and Dan Henderson were competitors in the horse trade, sure, but Dan had liked Maxwell's father, and Maxwell tended to be the Cooper son who most took after Pa. It was only in recent days that Dan Henderson made his displeasure with him known. Maxwell couldn't figure why, but he had a suspicion. He paused, working for a moment to grab his water bottle and to snatch his discarded shirt off his duffel bag. He mopped the sweat from his brow and shoulders. A copy of Rains peeked out the corner pocket of his bag. He had tried to leave the magazine at home. He had tried to put the article out of his mind, but no amount of physical labor could keep its contents from intruding on his thoughts. A bad apple, the self-satisfied writer had labeled him. He was a two-bit cowboy wannabe who devoted his energy to pleasure horses out in the middle of Montana. Worse, he was the Cooper brother who lacked a real education. Every success he had found, the article suggested, was due to his family's wealth and connections. None of it was to be credited to Maxwell's own skill, or lack thereof, the article hinted. He might have been able to ignore the hit piece if it didn't have a point. Maxwell had yet to lasso a real prize in the horse-buying market, and most days it felt like the whole world knew it. If they hadn't, they certainly did now. Maxwell mopped his face again and looked up. He felt eyes on him, and it wasn't just Louis. A cluster of the barn's female riders were grouped together by the water cooler. When they saw him looking, their hanging jaws snapped shut, and they quickly turned back to one another in an awkward chorus of giggles. Why do they keep staring like that? Maxwell wondered aloud. Louis shrugged. The piece of grass he chewed gave a particularly fibrous crunch, but other than that, he had no answer to relieve Maxwell's puzzlement. Which was fine. Maxwell could come up with plenty of reasons for all the attention he received on his own, starting with that damn article. No doubt everyone was discussing it endlessly behind his back. Why else would those women gawk so openly until he glanced their way, then avert their eyes and conversation quickly away from him? He knew they were talking about him. Even from across the stable, he could read the syllables of his name on their lips. Maxwell Cooper. Maxwell bent back to his work, and Louis vanished into the stall next door to continue whatever it was he did out here at Henderson's. If Maxwell knew Louis, and he did, having both hired and fired him last year, the stable hand probably spent the majority of his time sneaking off to smoke. Man had a habit like you wouldn't believe, especially in this enlightened and, for the most part, nicotine-free day and age. It was why he was always chewing on something. It helped to keep the cravings at bay in the barns. Louis harbored no hard feelings for Maxwell that he could discern. Maxwell knew he was a good employer because he never made his decisions personal, and any Montana-grown cowboy, even one as half-assed as Louis, could appreciate a straightforward decision. Maxwell wasn't sure he could say the same for Dan Henderson. Dan was feeling an ill will toward him all right. Their encounter down at the bar the other night had been frostier than Maxwell's after-work beer. A few more scoops of straw, and he decided he couldn't take the suspense any longer. He needed to get to the bottom of why Henderson was pissed at him. Maxwell leaned his rake against the wheelbarrow, tucked his shirt into his back pocket, and headed for the office. He was surprised to find the door shut. Maxwell always kept the office door open at his own barn. Leaning in, he realized Dan was already in conversation with someone else. Or more accurately, Dan was already in a furious argument with someone else. "I'm not the one who fumbled the tip," Henderson roared. "Do you have any idea how much those loose lips of yours may have just cost me?" Maxwell leaned away from the door, even though every horse-trading instinct told him to press in and see what else he might overhear. Whatever underling Dan was currently upbraiding had his full sympathy. Fiona, Dan's wife, had taken on the show barn as her pet project, and her management had contributed mightily to the barn's success. It was no secret that Dan, simultaneous to his wife's achievement, was trying to make his own way in the horse-selling game. If one of his employees had given up a valuable tip to a competitor, then no wonder they were having their ass handed to them. A muffled voice responded. Maxwell couldn't hear the words said in reply, but he could hear that it was a woman facing Dan's wrath, and his heart sank into his stomach the instant he recognized who it was. Lena Fudge. The underling who had fumbled Dan's tip was Lena. Even with the door shut, Maxwell's memories were enough to conjure the beautiful newbie horse trader, dazzling, eager green eyes, a blinding white smile, and a head of rioting gold curls that would tempt any hot-blooded country boy to take a tumble in the hay. And those were just the features Lena presented to the world. She was even more phenomenal without her clothes on. "Please, Dan, I understand why you're angry, but I won't fail you again. I really need this job right now." "After a blown tip of that proportion, Lena? Are you serious? You might as well have ripped up your own paycheck. You cost me a fortune by casting those Arab princes out into the public." Maxwell's heart, relocated to his stomach, now sank into his boots. He was pretty sure he knew why Dan wasn't speaking to him now. He knew what tip they were talking about. It was the one Lena had given him. Snuggled in close, basking in the afterglow of explosively good sex, she hadn't been able to suppress herself. And Maxwell, just as intoxicated by her naked, sweat-shimmering body pressed against his own, hadn't thought to advise her against it. The Arab princes were notorious throughout the horse-trading world as a group of elusive high rollers. No one had known they intended to visit the Montana horse shows in the coming months until Lena had found it out, and found out they were looking for flashy pleasure mounts. He had just the horse in his own stable. The tip about the princes was a good one, the best he'd ever received, and he hadn't even paid for it. "Well, I did make a deposit of a sort," Maxwell mused, and was half ashamed for the lewdness of the thought. From the sound of things, Lena was the one paying for the tip now. "I told one other person." "One," Lena said. "The tip isn't public, and when I realized how badly I'd screwed up, I came to you immediately. And I can't be fired, Dan. Not right now, please. You can probably see it for yourself, but I can see very well why you might want to retain your job, Miss Fudge." Did Maxwell detect a sneer in Dan Henderson's voice? His blood rose, and his sense of chivalry sharpened its sword. "You're certainly taking up more of my office than you were 5 months ago." What the hell? Maxwell had no idea what they were talking about, but it chafed him to think that Dan might be making a dig at her weight. He had never known the other man to stoop this low. Now more than ever, he wanted to break down the door and come to Lena's rescue. His hand was already on the door handle when another memory hit him, and he paused. In the days and weeks following their torrid passion, he hadn't been able to find her. Lena had almost completely disappeared from the circuit. He had waited for a phone call, but as the months passed, he gave up hope of ever hearing from her again. Getting ghosted by Lena had hurt more than he expected. He thought they had a real spark of a connection between them. What's more, he knew he had been Lena's first. He considered it an honor and a privilege to be the first man to take the virginal beauty in his arms and make her see stars. But now he wondered if those same stars weren't aligning for a reason. Maybe Lena hadn't felt the same things that night as he had. The conversation was breaking up. Maxwell glanced down and was appalled to see that he was still shirtless. This was definitely not how he had imagined meeting Lena again. Half naked and eavesdropping in his neighbor's barn. The door handle was already turning. Maxwell took a quick step back, raked a hand through his tangle of sweat-soaked hair, and resigned himself to being discovered. The door opened, Lena Fudge stood before him, shoulders hunched in defeat. She looked up the same instant he looked down. Their eyes met halfway, before Maxwell found his attention inexorably pulled to her rounded middle. Lena was pregnant. Chapter 2. She would recognize that set of abs anywhere. Maxwell? Lena's voice was all bewilderment as she stared at the half-naked, Adonis-like apparition before her. It seemed completely unfair that the afternoon sunlight should stream past his shoulders like that in threaded come-hither golden rays. Lena had thought her day couldn't possibly get worse until she saw him. First, her mother tells her she sold the house and diner. Her move to Florida planned before Lena's bombshell unstoppable. And now this. Desperation clawed at Lena's insides, but she decided to pass it off as hormones. God knew those little chemical monsters had been her constant companions these past months. But hormones hadn't just made her beg Dan Henderson for her job back, and they weren't about to deliver her from this situation now with Maxwell. His eyes rounded in disbelief as they drank in her distended belly. Lena, conscious of just how public the aisle of the barn was, grabbed him by the bicep, hard to miss those, and all but dragged him into the tack room. She yanked the sliding door shut behind them, and it closed with a rattle. Lena! Now it was his turn to utter her name in confusion. His eyebrows pulled together as he stared at the sliver of her belly poking out from beneath her too-tight t-shirt. She hadn't made the transition to maternity clothes yet. She could practically see the pages of his mental calendar flying backward as he tried to pin a date on her mistake. Might as well put him out of his misery. "It's your fault I'm in this situation," she hissed. She jammed a finger into his abs, as if she were accusing them rather than the man who owned them. Maxwell flexed against her assault and made the situation 10 times worse. "If you hadn't fooled me into leaking that damn tip to you—" His hand steadied her shoulders, and Lena realized she was unbalanced in more ways than one. She still wasn't used to the pregnancy weight. Her frame had remained slender overall, which meant that there had been little doubt what was happening to her the minute she started to show. Her boobs and hips were giving her curvaceous stomach a run for its money, and as Maxwell's eyes dragged down her again, she couldn't help flushing at his look. She was self-conscious enough with all the physical changes without him staring at her as if she was a favorite delicacy he hadn't sampled for years. The doctor had warned her that all her own appetites would be returning with a vengeance now that she was in her second trimester. Lena could practically feel his inspection of her body as his eyes continued to drag over her. She cleared her throat and settled her hands atop his. She pressed his touch into her shoulders as she summoned the courage to deliver the news. There was no sidestepping the issue shut up in the cramped tack room. "I'm pregnant," she said. "I can see that. I can see that you can see that." This wasn't turning out at all like she had planned. Lena's eyes narrowed as she fought to focus. Her day was in complete upheaval, but that didn't mean she couldn't take control of this moment. God knew she hadn't been in control the last time Maxwell Cooper laid his hands on her. "The baby is yours, Maxwell." The hands on her shoulders tightened protectively. If he felt any surprise now, it didn't register on his face. He watched her from beneath the unkempt thicket of dark hair. Hesitantly, then with renewed conviction, Lena reached forward to brush some of it back behind his ears. She wanted a clear view of his expression as she continued. "I was going to tell you once I got out of the first trimester." Even with a full view of his face, she couldn't tell if he bought the lie. She had never planned on telling Maxwell about the pregnancy. Hell, she had never planned on running into him again. She knew how the family curse always unfolded. The women got pregnant, and the men who were half responsible for making the child always took off. She had resigned herself to her fate as soon as the test came up positive. And maybe a desperate part of her still wanted to believe Maxwell wasn't like all the rest. Better to keep her romantic ideas of him intact and accept her new reality without ever having to feel the real sting of rejection. "You're in your second trimester now?" he asked. "Yes." She grinned weakly. Surprise. The word came out as more of a croak. God, she was really earning that piece of pie tonight. "Where have you been all this time? Why didn't you—" He broke off and stared at her with the same bewildered expression. "That's not all," Lena forged ahead. That tip I gave you about the Arab princes coming to town? That wasn't intended for you. I was supposed to pass it along to my employer, Dan Henderson. But then I interfered with you, Maxwell guessed. I'm sorry, Lena. Lena tried for another hopeless laugh and shook her head. Interfered isn't the word I would use. But yes. You came along and I made more than one mistake that night. She kicked herself the next instant for calling sex with Maxwell a mistake. Even after 5 months of chaos, she had never thought of their night together as anything but earth-shaking. He had been her first, after all. Since then, he had been almost all she could think about. The events of today had been giving his starring role on the stage of her brain a run for its money, until the man himself decided to show up. Maxwell kept his thoughts to himself on the subject of their night together. His palms slid down the outsides of her shoulders. He was rubbing her, as if she were one of his skittish horses that required comforting. You don't need to worry about a thing, Lena. I'll take care of you from here. Just don't disappear on me again. I won't. Looking into his eyes, she could scarcely remember how to breathe. This was what it was like, then, to have a knight in shining armor ride to your rescue. Lena had always figured herself for the type of woman who would save herself when push came to shove, but she wouldn't deny how amazing it felt to let his reassurances soothe her. At least one of them seemed to have a plan. Maxwell wrapped his arm around her as they left the tack room. The smell of polished saddles and soft leather bridles was a comfort, but his arm was even more so. Lena leaned into him before spotting the collection of women watching them from the other end of the stable. She froze. The crowd was small, but each and every one of them must have seen them ducked together into the privacy of the tack room. And Maxwell was shirtless. Her companion also froze beneath their stares. "Does everyone know?" he whispered in exasperation. Lena shook her head. "Number I haven't told anyone else." She had been too embarrassed already with word of her bungled tip getting out. She had kept her lips tightly sealed against giving any indication that Maxwell was also the father of her child. "Not that. The damn article." Lena giggled. "You think they read Rains? Boy, you're bad at reading people. You're being objectified," she explained. "They're not staring at you, Maxwell. They're staring at your six-pack." Lena couldn't say she blamed them. She had never seen a more stimulating group of muscles. Maxwell glanced down, and his hair hung into his eyes. Tarzan, was Lena's absurd thought. Without a real haircut and wearing only an expression of self-reflective confusion, Maxwell might have easily been mistaken for a sexy wild man fresh off a lifelong primal excursion in the woods. She trembled all over to think what such a man might do to the next woman to draw his notice. Damn appetites, Lena thought again as she looked away. 2 pieces of pie it is. Chapter 3. Not even a week later, and they were arguing on Lena's mother's doorstep. "I'll just go and get you another medicine," Maxwell exclaimed. A part of him was having a hard time wrapping his head around their current situation. He stood on Lena's porch like a jilted lover begging to be taken back, which, in a way, he realized he was. Behind him and staked into the law, the "sold" sign waved in the breeze. Lena's mother was well underway in the process of moving to Florida, and Lena herself was apartment hunting. As if she didn't already have enough on her plate, what with the baby and losing her job. Lena stood on the other side of the threshold, doing her best to fill the doorframe and failing. Maxwell didn't care if she was carrying twins. Oh God, the woman was still too lissom to really throw her weight around. He gazed past her shoulder into the living room with an unconcealed look of longing. What he wouldn't give to be inside having this conversation like 2 sane adults. "I don't want another medicine," Lena protested. "And anyway, you already drove 4 hours to get this one. It was a wasted trip." "Well, I'm a billionaire." Maxwell shrugged. He didn't understand why Lena should be concerned about his gas. If it was his time she was worried about monopolizing, then he obviously needed to try harder to prove to her the lengths he was willing to go. "Ugh, don't remind me." Lena pressed a hand to her forehead. For a moment, Maxwell thought she was going to be sick again. The nausea that accompanied her pregnancy had been getting worse these past few days. Hence all his research to find her a cure, and all that driving to bring it to her. As if you weren't already the absolute perfect man. Huh? He wasn't sure he heard her right. He felt far from perfect in that moment. Lena's face reddened. Nothing. You may be perfect, but the remedy you bought isn't. If anything, it made me sicker. I already told you I'll go back and get— I don't want medicine, Maxwell, Lena exclaimed. I'm doing fine mitigating all this on my own. You said you weren't feeling well, he shouted back. He didn't know why he was shouting. He wasn't particularly angry, just frustrated that he couldn't wrap his head around whatever it was bothering Lena. So I did the research and found the solution. I wasn't feeling well because of all the cookies I ate, Lena exploded. There, I said it, I've confessed. She waved the box of anti-nausea medication. Nothing you do can help me, because I did this to myself. I've been baking nonstop because you are driving me crazy with the helicopter cowboy routine. I need space, Maxwell, and so does the baby. You've had 5 months of space, Maxwell protested, and realized too late that he sounded like an insensitive idiot. Lena growled and threw up her hands. The medication hit the deck and bounced beneath the porch swing. I don't have time to pack my things, job hunt, grow a human, and deal with this right now. She turned. Where are you going? Maxwell demanded. She left the door wide open as she stormed off. To preheat the oven, I'm baking a cake, Lena shouted. And I'm probably going to make myself sick eating it. This is ridiculous, Maxwell thought. He supposed it was a bit too late to diagnose their argument as absurd. He debated going after her. He poked the toe of his cowboy boot through the doorway, then quickly retracted it when a pair of fuzzy slippers appeared. It was Lena's grandmother. The elderly woman was holding her ears as if someone had boxed them. What's all this commotion about? She rasped. The two of you woke me up early from my nap. Sorry, ma'am. Maxwell backed off another step sheepishly. He rotated his hat around and around in his hands, worrying the wide brim until one of the stitches unraveled. It's Lena. I'm trying to do my best by her, but— Grandma Fudge sighed and motioned for him to join her on the porch swing. Maxwell did, politely holding the swinging chair for her so she could situate herself first. When she patted the spot beside her, he sat. He was a big, corn-fed cowboy, too big for the swing, but he supposed one more absurdity was appropriate to top off the afternoon. See here. Lena's grandmother laid a gnarled hand on his knee. The role of a man, in pregnancy and in life, is to support his woman. That means listening to her, helping when asked, and talking to her like a partner. I'm doing all those things, he said. Grandma Fudge shook her head. You have to ask Lena what she wants. You can't just assume. That's when it stops being a collaboration, see? I'm reading all the books. He couldn't stop himself from adding. He wanted Lena's grandmother to know about the effort he was putting in. I know it'd be easy to just ask Lena, but I'm trying to anticipate. And I promise you, I'm going to get better at it. I'm going to take care of her and our child. I'm not going to walk out on her. Grandma Fudge sighed and shook her head. I'm not worried about you walking out on Lena. I'm worried about you caving in the door to get to her. You're holding her too tight. If you keep reining her in, then Lena may very well be the one who bolts. No. An idea was suddenly taking shape in his brain. He laid his hand on Grandma Fudge's to let her know it wasn't an outright denial of her words, but his thoughts were already racing a mile a minute as his plan started to form. Lena won't walk away, because I'm going to give her the one thing she wants more than anything. Oh. Grandma Fudge raised a finely penciled and wholly unconvinced eyebrow. And what is it that you think she needs this time? A job, Maxwell said with certainty. I'm going to get Lena a job. Chapter 4. In Ranchland, Montana, Cooper Ranch had always stood out like a jewel to Lena. She had never come onto the property itself before, but she had driven by it enough times to understand that it was something special. It wasn't just that it carried the name of the Cooper family dynasty, and that it was tied to the country Coop retail empire. The sun just always seemed to shine on Maxwell's property. As Lena let herself through the gate, she stopped a moment to breathe the sweet summer air. She smelled fresh-cut grass and horse manure, wildflowers, and the fragrant clematis beside the family ranch house. With a baby on the way, it sometimes felt like her sense of smell had honed itself into a superpower. Lena. Lena turned and smiled when she saw Maxwell jogging up the path from the barn. Maxwell! She waved as he joined her. I parked back on the road. I thought a walk would be nice. I hope I didn't keep you waiting. Didn't keep me waiting at all. His eyebrows drew together in concern at her use of the word walk, but whatever his worries were, he kept them to himself. He removed his black Stetson, and Lena's heart raced as more of his handsome face came into view. Did he intend to kiss her? Did she want to kiss him? Of course she did. No matter how crazy he drove her with his obnoxious over-attentiveness, the memory of his lips burning a trail across her virgin skin was too hot to dismiss. She stared at his mouth now and parted her lips. She racked her brain for another signal to give off, but before she could come up with something, Maxwell glanced away and toed a rock with his boot. Damn. There went her hormones again. Maybe she had only imagined the desire darkening his eyes. What did you want to show me? She asked, in an attempt to recover the moment. I thought I'd give you a tour of the barn. Maxwell nodded over his shoulder. I would love that. She suspected there was more to it than that, but held her tongue. It was no secret that with her mom moving to Florida, Lena was going to have to find her own place. The contemplative look that had crossed his face when she told him as much made her wonder if an offer was incoming. If Maxwell invited her to live with him, would she accept? She thought it would be easier on them both if he found her a place on the property other than the main house. But maybe that was hoping for too much. I need to quit getting ahead of myself, Lena chided herself. How's the job hunt going? He asked her as they started back for the barn. She shook her head and sighed. Horribly. No one wants to hire a pregnant single mother in this economy. Or any economy, I suppose. They made small talk as they strolled, punctuated by Maxwell pointing out various points of interest within the barn. Lena had been inside her fair share since becoming a broker for the horse trade, and she was impressed with how well ordered he kept the operation. He introduced her to Dennis and Tick, his senior stable hands, and a few of the Quarab horses that poked their adorable wedge-shaped faces out the stall doors to peer at her. Lena paused to stroke one horse's satin-soft nose. She knew Quarabs, a cross between Arabian, quarter, and paint horses, could vary widely, but this one had to be the flashiest and most expensive specimen in the herd. Maxwell led her into the office. He pulled a chair out for her, and Lena sat gratefully. She tried not to let it show too obviously on her face that she was glad to be off her feet for a minute. She was barely halfway through her pregnancy, and going on a tour of the barns with him shouldn't really exhaust her yet. Maybe she was just crashing from the sugar rush she had given herself that morning with her fresh-baked scones. Thank you, she said of his chivalrous gesture. He didn't join her in sitting down. He slid a stapled document from the other side of the desk over to her. Then he turned away to pace. Lena crooked an eyebrow. What's this? Look it over, Maxwell advised. It outlines all the details of the job I want to hire you for. Hire me? Lena blinked. She could scarcely believe what she was hearing. Are you serious? Dead serious. Maxwell stopped pacing and turned to look at her. The neighboring barn is hosting its yearly sale, and there's a horse ranch about a half-hour out that will be organizing something similar before the end of the month. Those events bring in a ton of buyers. Like the Arab princes. Lena rotated the contract beneath her fingers. But help me understand, Maxwell. How do I factor into that? I want to take advantage of the prospective clientele coming in. These are people I might never normally get a crack at. Maxwell cracked his knuckles like he was preparing for a fight. You know the routine. A pre-sale day for VIP buyers, along with a regular sale day, plus a demonstration day or two so the sellers can show off their horses. Are you going to include your stock or pleasure horses? Lena prompted. Maxwell's excitement was infectious. His eyes glimmered. Both. Maybe next year I'll get in on the Mustang makeover event, but this year, I'm all about selling horses. Lena clapped her hands together and grinned. She was a huge fan of the Mustang showcase. The trainers, skilled beyond belief, worked magic with their horses, and the formerly wild Mustangs available for adoption were absolutely majestic to behold. It's going to be a lot of work, Maxwell said. I could really use someone like you. Lena's cheeks warmed. Someone like me? Maxwell scratched the back of his head. I'm not much of a talker. You have a gift for starting conversations with people. Everyone knows it. His gaze was nothing short of admiring, but Lena was less certain that her hallmark trait as a talker was a blessing. It felt more like a handicap recently. Lena hated the thought of taking advantage of anyone's charity, especially Maxwell's. She didn't want him extending her a helping hand because he felt responsible, or worse, sorry for her. He may be a knight in shining armor, but she was determined to avoid becoming the damsel in distress. But she could entertain a real job offer. I must admit this sounds wonderful, she said as she pulled the contract closer to her. And just skimming over the language of the agreement, it looks like I'll be responsible for helping out with all the same chores as everybody else. I can work with that. I don't want you around the horses, Maxwell said. Lena pointed out a paragraph to him, but his eyes didn't leave her face. This line clearly states that all employees are expected to lend a hand in the barns. I'll change the language. I don't want to be an exception, she emphasized. You are an exception, he exclaimed. Lena, how can you not see that? His words stunned her and made her heart pull off a gymnastics routine she hadn't been aware it was training for. Still, she couldn't read too much into what it meant to be exceptional to Maxwell. She was carrying his baby. Of course he wanted to make matters easy for her. But she couldn't proudly look herself in the mirror every morning if she accepted his charity. If you really value what I can bring as an employee, she replied, then what I want shouldn't be a problem. I'll only take the job if you keep the demands of the stable work in the contract. I don't want any special treatment. I want to earn what I earn. I want the same contract as anyone else. Maxwell stared helplessly. Lena watched as he peeled his gloves off and snapped them against his thigh methodically, as if keeping time to a song only he could hear. She didn't know the man as well as she should, considering he was the father of her child, but she knew what that little habit of his meant. He was debating, or frustrated, or both. How badly did he really want this? How badly did he want her? She could see she had him cornered. Either he was a liar and did not value her the same as a real, true employee, or he was at the mercy of her demands now to prove otherwise. Lena crossed her arms. The baby bump tended to get in the way of her negotiating posture these days, but she knew it was enough to still get the message across. She was serious about this, damn it, and she wanted Maxwell to be too. All right, he relented. His expression told her it had been almost physically painful for him to do so. Looks like I'm not going to talk you out of it. No, she agreed. Sign here. Maxwell pushed the contract back across the table to her, and Lena penned her signature eagerly. And no assigning me any of the lighter workloads, you hear, she said. It was a belated thought. No promises, Maxwell replied. He tugged the document from her hands before she could think to hold it hostage, folded it, and tucked it into his back jean pocket. Did he really think she wouldn't stoop to snatching it out of there? Lena studied his ass as he turned away. God, she wanted to take a bite out of it. Her own thoughts were enough to make her blush in half-hearted horror. To think she had been a virgin before she crossed paths with the cowboy only 5 months ago. Maxwell had awakened an appetite in her, and she was afraid of what it might mean. Agreeing to be his employee made him her boss and only complicated any potential relationship tenfold. What was she thinking? I'm trying to keep our heads above water, she thought as she touched her stomach. That's what I'm thinking. She just wished it didn't feel like drowning every time she looked at Maxwell. She refused to surrender to her family's curse. She would provide for this child without sacrificing her dreams. Besides, how hard could a little farm work really be? Chapter 5. Maxwell. Maxwell reared up out of bed. It was early morning. He didn't need to read the time on the bedside clock to know just how early. He had risen with the dawn since as far back as he could remember. He ran a hand over his face as he collected himself. His hair hung in snarled tangles, and the sheets weren't much better. He tried to recall the nightmare that had woken him up, but decided it was probably better left banished from his mind. Whatever the phantom threat had been, he knew where it had been directed. Lena and his child. He shouldn't have let her sign the contract. He had been so eager to put his plan for hiring her into motion that he hadn't stopped to consider the potential ramifications. What was he thinking, letting a pregnant woman sign on for this sort of work? He threw on his red flannel shirt, not bothering to button the front, and slid into his jeans. He brooded as his coffee brewed. He definitely felt like he needed a shower after a fitful night's sleep, but he wanted to get a few of the filthier chores in first. He walked downstairs from his apartment, blowing the steam off his mug. When he arrived at the barn, he froze and nearly dropped his mug of coffee. Lena was dressed in work clothes, humming to herself as she cleaned one of the stalls. It was the second in the row on the left, and as his eyes dragged over to the first, he realized the straw there had already been refreshed. Dandelion Child poked her head over the stall door and snuffled. The first stall, unlike the second, wasn't empty. Maxwell's sleep-deprived brain dragged over the significance sluggishly. Lena would have had to enter the stall on her own and lead Dandy out into the aisle before she got in there to clean. By the looks of things, she had done just that, all without supervision. "What the hell are you doing here this early, Lena?" He didn't mean to curse, and felt even worse when she jumped with surprise and turned. Her curly hair was pulled off her neck and tied in a ponytail, and a smudge of dirt on her face made her even cuter than usual. Her baby bump poked out from beneath the bottom of her shirt. "Morning, Maxwell. I thought I'd get a head start." Lena straightened her posture and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. He noticed she wore a pair of old work gloves that had been knocking around the barn for a while, too small for most of the ranch hands. He had thought about giving them to her but stopped himself at the last minute. He hadn't wanted to encourage her to tackle the ranch's physical labor, even though she had expressed an interest. "I don't want you doing any of this by yourself," he said seriously. "And I especially don't want you interacting with the horses on your own. It's dangerous." The thought of what one kick would do to their future brought all his nightmares howling back into his brain. Maxwell set his mug on a post and crossed the distance between them quickly. He caught the pitchfork, intent on prying it out of her hands, but Lena hung on. "I can take care of myself." It wasn't her usual arguing posture, though. Her eyes searched his, almost curious, and Maxwell wondered what his expression must be. "And you're not the only one who grew up in Montana, Maxwell. I've been around horses almost all my life. There's no place I feel safer. Isn't it the same for you?" He held on to the pitchfork a moment longer, then relented. He turned away. "I used to think I trusted my horses more than anyone," he murmured. "But I've seen what a kick can do to a man. Much less—" "Hey." Lena laid a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay? You're looking pretty freaked out. Maybe you should sit down." Maxwell snorted. Dandy echoed him, and Lena laughed. It felt like the whole barn was conspiring against him. "I was just about to suggest the same to you," he said, ignoring their comedy duo. "Why don't you take a break and let me turn over a few stalls? Why don't you join me?" Lena raised an eyebrow in challenge. "There's another pitchfork leaning against the wall by the office." Maxwell knew where the other tools were. He sighed in defeat, turned, and snatched it up. He took over cleaning the stall next to her. Most of the horses were still out to pasture. Dandy was recovering from a tendon injury, so it was just the three of them in the barn. "You don't have to do this, you know." He threw the remark over his shoulder, along with a forkful of soiled hay. "Do what?" He didn't need to look up to see the wildly innocent look on her face. "You don't need to prove anything, not to me." "Who says I'm trying to prove anything to you?" Lena took hold of the wheelbarrow before he could, and trundled it out to dump the manure they had gathered. Maxwell flicked his hair out of his eyes, leaned against his pitchfork, and fixed her with a patient look. "If anyone has something to prove, it's you," she mentioned, as she wheeled back over and disappeared into the neighboring stall. "Yeah? What's that?" "I'm not sure you know how to do chores with a shirt on," she said. "You'll have to prove me wrong someday." Maxwell glanced down at himself. He was wearing a shirt today. He had just forgotten to button it. He still didn't get what all the fuss was about. "Does seeing a man's chest make you uncomfortable?" Lena laughed. "Not uncomfortable. But you're my boss now, Maxwell. I have to keep an eye on these things." "You have to keep an eye on my chest." He couldn't help himself. A smile dragged up one corner of his mouth when he saw Lena's rake pause mid-swing. He turned back to his own work as if he didn't know what he just said. "I have to keep an eye on how things look," Lena said. "Between you and me." "And how do things look?" Maxwell was genuinely curious. Rumors hounded the Cooper brothers like dogs, and most days he felt like he bore the brunt of it by sticking so close to home. He hadn't said a word to anyone about the baby, save for his mother, and he knew Lena had kept the news under wraps as best as she could. But there wasn't a whole lot she could do to divert the gossips, looking the way she did now. Ravishing. The thought surprised Maxwell. It was like a punch to the gut that he was immediately eager to invite again. He leaned back out of the stall to get a look at her. She was turned away from him, forcing dirt out the stall's back door in brown, billowing clouds with the push broom. Her blue jeans hugged her hips as if they had been painted on that morning. Her ass wagged at him, round and sensual. He remembered the last time he had laid his hands on it. 5 months later, did Lena still feel the intensity of his grip and the possessive way his fingers had tightened on her flesh? Did she imagine the smarting sting of his palm as he delivered a light slap in the heat of their rocking passion? His hands tingled to deliver another. "I don't know. How do things look? You seem to be doing an awful lot of looking for someone who wanted to turn over stalls by himself a second ago." Lena took the wheelbarrow and passed him again. Maxwell blinked and realized that she had already finished putting fresh straw down in the second stall. He hadn't even finished cleaning his out. "It's not a competition, Lena." "Then you won't mind that I've already turned over more stalls than you," she concluded with a self-satisfied smile. She parked the wheelbarrow between them on his right and started in on the next stall. Not a competition, Maxwell thought. He needed to hammer the point home for himself, needed to lead by example, but he couldn't help rising to her obvious challenge. He began to shovel more quickly, heaping the rest of the manure onto the wheelbarrow. The stall filled with a cloud of dust as he swept the floor in a hurry. Not a competition morphed into no breaking for coffee in his brain. The mug he left on the post had stopped steaming 10 minutes ago. "Well, well." Lena laughed in amusement from the stall next to him. He didn't look up from his task, but his gaze did slide sideways when she let herself back out into the aisle. An unruly curl had sprung free from her ponytail. It corkscrewed between her flashing green eyes and down the bridge of her pert nose. Her cheeks glowed with exertion beneath the film of dirt that covered her. She reached for the handles of the wheelbarrow, but Maxwell's hands came down sooner. "Allow me. It's only fair." "I thought you might need a handicap considering you're still running behind." "Funny," he remarked as he carted the barrow out to dump it. "I thought the same for you." Lena picked up the pace after that, and so did he. They leapfrogged over one another to the next stall, and then the next stall. Maxwell, who had been cleaning barns all his life, found that he was actually working up a sweat. He stripped out of his flannel shirt and hung it on a nail in the aisle. He wondered if he only imagined her workflow stuttered. He tucked his chin, smiling to himself. Lena beat him to the last stall. Maxwell stood back to observe, laying aside his gloves and taking a drag off his cold coffee, grateful for the refreshment. His chest rose and fell as he watched her. Lena was panting as well, but she showed no signs of joining him for a break. He watched the way her body moved. Even pregnant, the confidence she had in her own skin was mesmerizing. He wasn't sure how many stalls she had mucked personally in her lifetime, but she made it seem like an almost glamorous undertaking. There was no bigger turn-on, he decided, than watching a beautiful woman take charge of what needed to be done. He set his coffee aside and moved into the stall with her. Lena looked up. "Hey, don't think you can take credit for—" Maxwell claimed her fork and set it aside. Her breath caught, and she stopped talking. She stared up at him with startled eyes as he pushed her against the wall. "Maxwell." He said nothing. He had always been a man of few words, especially before Lena came into the picture. She was good at opening up and getting other people to open up in turn. Still, there were some moments where words served no other purpose than to postpone the inevitable. His hand caressed the side of her face and splayed along her jaw. Her cheeks were pillow-soft beneath the pads of his fingers. He stroked all the way down to her neck. Her pulse beat beneath his thumb, and he pressed it lightly. Lena shuddered. She pressed forward into his touch, her eyes closed and her lips parted. Maxwell accepted her invitation. His mouth moved in to claim hers, and Lena sighed in the seconds before his lips sealed over her own. 5 months, and almost all he had been able to think about was this moment. Even with the Rains article, and Dan Henderson, and the horse trading tip that might very well cement his success, he hadn't been able to get Lena Fudge out of his head. She moved beneath him, and Maxwell pressed in closer. The swell of her stomach butted against his, and the visible sliver of her naked skin brushed against his own. He deepened the kiss almost without meaning to, egged on by the sensation of their bodies in a slow-motion collision. His tongue rolled against his teeth and unfurled into Lena's eager mouth. She pushed into him as they tangled and warred for dominance. He had almost lost track of his hands at this point. He rediscovered them knotted in her hair. Her ponytail came loose, and her tresses flowed over his fingers. He made a fist, and Lena broke from the kiss with a wild gasp. Maxwell stared into her eyes. His breathing was even more ragged now than it had been before. Lena looked back at him and smiled. If he hadn't already been rock hard, then seeing that shy grin would have stiffened him in a second. He leaned in again and paused. He watched Lena's smile drop off her face. Her skin bleached a ghastly shade of pale beneath the dirt. "Lena?" She blinked as if she couldn't quite get him into focus. Then her eyes rolled, and she sagged in his arms. If Maxwell hadn't been there to catch her, she would have dropped to the floor in a dead faint. "Lena!" This time he shouted her name, his voice far too loud for how close they stood. But she didn't respond. Dandy whickered and stamped her panic on the far side of the barn. Maxwell hoisted Lena into his arms and ran for the truck, snagging his shirt with a finger on the way. Tick was just coming down from the bunkhouses and froze with a mug of coffee in his hand. "Boss?" What the hell happened? His eyes glinted with fear when he saw the pregnant woman in Maxwell's arms. She passed out. Maxwell braced Lena against him with one arm as he pulled the back door open on the crew cab so he could lay her on the seat. It didn't even occur to him in that moment to ask Tick to assist him. His head was full of nightmares, of Lena, of their baby. "I'm headed to the hospital now. Tell Dennis he's in charge." Tick nodded. "Will do. Call the office when you know what's up." Maxwell nodded as he hauled himself into the cab. He reached back behind him to secure Lena's seatbelt as best he could, and his hands froze over her belly. Oh God, what was the matter with her? Chapter 6. "And that's how Maxwell Cooper kissed a girl and swept her off her feet," Lena concluded. "See, not a bad story once you know how to spin it the right way." Maxwell looked less convinced. He sat in the chair beside her hospital bed with his arms crossed. Just looking at the sharp angles of his chosen piece of furniture told Lena it couldn't possibly be comfortable, but he hadn't moved from her side since she'd woken. The news wasn't as bad as he had been taking it. In her haste to rise early that morning and prove to him just how much she was able to handle, Lena had forgotten to eat breakfast. The physical exertion on an empty stomach, coupled with dehydration, had thrown her body out of whack, and she had passed out in the stall. A part of her was secretly grateful that Maxwell had been there to catch and deliver her into the arms of her gently exasperated nurse in the local ER. "This isn't funny, Lena," Maxwell responded eventually. Could he really blame her for trying to make light of the situation? She was hooked up to half a dozen monitors and had been ordered to spend the night. She was trying to go with the flow and look on the bright side. It could have been a lot worse, but it wasn't. Still, Maxwell looked as if someone he cherished had just died in his arms. Lena blushed. She was trying to bring some levity to the situation with her jokes, not add to the drama by imagining how much she might mean to Maxwell. "All right," she conceded. "But you have to admit that there is a silver lining in all this." They both turned to look at the monitor closest to them. The screen enabled them to see the baby's heart beating. The nurse, knowing her audience, had even brought in speakers so they could listen. The little heart throbbed a steady rhythm, almost always in concert with Lena's own heart. "I admit it," Maxwell said quietly. He reached for her hand, and the machine monitoring her pulse sped. Her blush deepened. Being rendered this transparent was definitely not a silver lining. The door to the hospital room burst open suddenly, and Lena jumped. Her hand flew from his as if she were a guilty child caught sneaking birthday cake before the party. Maxwell's mother refused to be called Mrs. Cooper. She was Penny, and she was one of the prettiest women Lena had ever seen. She was small and slender, and her pleasant face was a network of laugh lines rather than outright wrinkles. Her hair was cut stylishly short and dyed a gorgeous copper red that Lena could almost believe was natural, if it weren't for the fresh-looking, flashy highlights. Penny lived a few towns over. When she got the call from Maxwell that morning, she had come running, or more accurately, flying down the road in her own pickup, Lena suspected, based on how quickly she'd arrived. She had no doubt that Maxwell had laid the full story up until this point on his mother. "Sorry. I had to run back to the ranch. Figured I'd whip you up a batch of cookies in case you got tired of eating the same old hospital food." Penny shot a distasteful look at the half-eaten container of applesauce left on a tray at Lena's bedside. Lena knew she should have eaten more. Maxwell had been berating her, before she distracted him with her plan for how to spin her fainting spell. But she couldn't stop thinking that the hospital's offering had the consistency of coagulated slime. She blamed it on the pregnancy. She simply didn't have the taste for certain things anymore. Or ever, if she was being honest. "Thank you. Those looked delicious." The pile of buttery, golden-brown cookies that Penny carried looked like they had been cut right out of an ad in Good Housekeeping. The aroma hit her, and her mouth watered as she took in each glistening chocolate chip. She still had an IV stuck in her arm pumping nutrients, but her stomach grumbled at the promise of real food. "Your pulse is picking up again," Maxwell mentioned. She noticed his amused glance in her direction and decided to ignore it. "It's interesting what excites you." "Reading my vitals is cheating," she said, as she accepted the plate of cookies from Penny. "But I shouldn't be surprised. You were definitely cheating out in the barn, too." "Was I?" "You employed unfair distraction tactics." "Did he?" Penny asked interestedly. Maxwell rose quickly to offer his mother the chair, and she sat down. Lena couldn't help thinking that he had an ulterior motive for the gentlemanly offering. He looked extremely uncomfortable with where the conversation was headed. "Sure did," Lena said. "Should I tell you?" "I'm going to get us some real food," Maxwell stated. He spun on his heel and exited the room. Point for me, Lena thought wickedly. She couldn't help keeping score. Try as Maxwell Cooper might to come onto her like a no-holds-barred rogue, he still got flustered when she met him halfway. It was one of the many things she was growing to like about him. "He's missing out. Geez, these are amazing." Lena filled her mouth with compliments for Penny's culinary prowess in an effort to stop herself from gorging on too many cookies too quickly. She sat back with a blissful sigh and shut her eyes, letting the melty chocolate coat her tongue as she chewed. She would never say it out loud, but Penny's cookies were practically orgasmic. "I'm going to have to get this recipe from you," she enthused as she took another bite. Penny smiled happily. "I'm glad you enjoy them. It's been so long since I was able to bake for someone who isn't myself. You wouldn't believe how much the boys ate growing up. But after we all moved on with our lives," she sighed. Lena stopped chewing for a moment out of sympathy. "But you live near Maxwell, right? Don't you visit each other?" Penny's smile returned. "I don't visit as often as I should. I know how his father was, and Maxwell takes after Robert like you wouldn't believe. Once he's locked onto a project, it's hard to turn his attention from it." "Well, maybe not so hard," Penny admitted with a pointed look at Lena's belly. Lena flushed. "You probably think I'm an idiot," she said sheepishly. Penny laughed. "Why? Because you took a little spill while pregnant? Please. You would be horrified to know how many times I fell on my ass while carrying Maxwell's brother, Sawyer." A shy smile tugged at the edges of Lena's lips. "He may have mentioned that. Pregnancy is not an illness. There's plenty you can still do. Hell, the last thing on earth you need is someone telling you what your limits are," Penny said. "Believe me, I've lived through it 3 times now. The comments that made you cranky as a working woman before have the power to turn you into the devil herself now. I shouldn't have pushed Maxwell. And I shouldn't have pushed myself. It's just—" Lena gazed dejectedly at her stomach. She must have looked ridiculous with the plate of cookies balanced atop it. But she couldn't shake the impression that she had messed up royally by sticking to her guns. So much has happened these past 5 months. I don't want my circumstances to get the better of me. I want to meet every challenge head on. By the time this baby is born, I want to have my life back on track. You don't have to go it alone. Trust my son, Lena. And if you can't bring yourself to trust him right away, then trust his mother. Penny laid a comforting hand on Lena's and didn't appear to notice the tangle of tubes that got in the way. Maxwell is a teddy bear under that stoic cowboy exterior. He's a good man. Lena nodded, but her throat stayed tight. She didn't know if she was ready to put all her trust in a man, good or otherwise. She knew how things had turned out for her mother and her grandmother. Hell, for every single woman in her family. They always wound up raising their children alone. Men were the downfall of fudge women. I know. Why don't you stay at the ranch? Penny leaned back with a bright laugh. Lena wondered how long Penny had been wanting to propose the idea. Her spontaneity seemed just a little contrived. That way, Maxwell can keep an eye on you properly. Mom already closed on the Florida condo, and apartment hunting hasn't really panned out as quickly as I hoped. Lena said hesitantly, You can stay at the ranch. Both women turned their heads. Maxwell's tall form filled the doorway. Lena's heart flipped at the sight of him, and she swallowed. Not good, she thought. You just saw him 5 minutes ago. Hell, you've seen the man naked. You should be used to looking at him by now. How badly did it bode for her escaping the family's curse that even being in the same room as Maxwell made her weak? His eyes were dark and meaningful as he gazed at her. You can stay with me, he insisted. Yep, definitely cursed. Chapter 7. All packed? Lena turned. Her heart pumped just a little faster to see Maxwell leaning in the doorway of her bedroom. But that was wrong. This room, and the house that contained it, they weren't hers anymore. All of the childhood memories she had made here, she carried with her now. There were no more belongings, and no more evidence that indicated she had ever been here at all. Just thinking, she lied, as she clicked her last suitcase closed and rose, about that sale you hope to make to that Arab royal family. I'm more than hopeful about it, Maxwell said. It's got to be done. That family has never stabled Montana stock before. Nailing a sale to them would secure Cooper Ranch's reputation for decades to come. Cooper Ranch already has a sterling reputation, Lena pointed out. But Maxwell didn't seem to hear her. Judging by his eyes and his suddenly tense expression, Lena had a feeling he had already mentally pulled up the Rains article and was torturing himself with a few choice passages. Maxwell, you have to know how well your business is doing. You're already the envy of every single breeder I've crossed paths with. We can do better, he concluded. The self-assurance in his tone implied another statement entirely. I can do better. Lena shrugged. It wasn't a battle she intended to fight. Not right now. She turned back to her stacked boxes of belongings and gave the emptied room one last sorrowful consideration. She fixed it in her memory. She heaved a sigh as she got to her feet. Lena. She turned and found Maxwell standing behind her. She didn't wait for an invitation. She buried her face in his chest. Don't cry, she thought viciously. Her fingers twisted in his shirt. She clung to him and tried to slow her breathing. She was surprised when Maxwell's hand found her back and began to make gentle, soothing circles between her shoulder blades. You were trying to distract me by talking shop, he accused. You should take a moment. I don't need any more moments, Maxwell. Really, I'm all right. Lena tried to extract herself from his arms, but Maxwell held her firmly. She paused to look up at him and offered the tentative beginnings of a brave smile. But her smile wouldn't hold when she saw the ponderous expression on his face. There was heat in his eyes, enough to make her aware of the sudden spike in temperature in the room. Well, maybe she could afford one more moment. The moment came when Maxwell's lips slid against her own. Lena leaned into him, as much as her rounded stomach would allow, as his arms constricted tightly around her. His lips moved against hers, gently insistent, and she opened to him with a shaky inhalation. The kiss was wet and warm and dizzying, and it was only then that Lena acknowledged she hadn't known if such a kiss from Maxwell would ever come her way again. But the unyielding way he held her told her he was helpless to curb his desire, and her trembling heart wondered what that might mean. Could he really? It was impossible to keep up her uncertain train of thought when his tongue kept teasing little breath-catching moans from her. The spark was there. It was definitely still there. And it was going to blaze up between them in a roaring inferno and burn the house down if she didn't do something about it. I'd better start loading up. Lena broke away from him and laid her hands on his chest. Maxwell's big hands dragged up to her shoulders, and he squeezed his acknowledgement in lieu of saying anything. Lena wondered if he was as winded as she felt. Thanks for any time. He headed her off before she could put what had just passed between them into words. She shifted uncomfortably when he didn't tear his gaze immediately from her. Maxwell blinked and surveyed the empty room. Want to take that? He pointed. Lena, still dizzy from their kiss, and didn't quite comprehend what he meant. She looked at the naked wall dumbly, before her eyes dropped to the novelty switch plate. It depicted 3 charging Mustangs running through the vaulted corridor of a mountain valley. She had loved that switch plate since she was a kid. It was jarring to realize she hadn't thought about it for years. Bring a little piece of home away with you, Maxwell encouraged. I suppose it wouldn't be totally out of place at the ranch, Lena said. Maxwell grinned. I'll get my screwdriver. They took the switch plate and Lena's things and loaded themselves up alongside everything in the truck. The drive back across the wide Montana countryside was peaceful. Lena rolled her window down, but spent half the drive only pretending to take in the scenery. She couldn't keep her eyes from straying to the mirrors and Maxwell's reflection. More than once, she caught him looking at her. She couldn't get that kiss out of her head. They arrived back at Cooper Ranch late in the afternoon. Lena was surprised when Maxwell, grabbing one of her suitcases, started down the path leading out toward the stables. We're not going to the main house? Lena wondered if Maxwell had decided against letting her live with him after all. She understood completely why he might have changed plans at the last minute. Being seen living with a female employee had to be bad optics. Never mind that her moving onto the property was already a pretty clear signal of the truth to any local gossips. Still, a part of Lena couldn't help feeling downcast at his change of heart. Did you decide to bunk me with the rest of the crew? She asked perkily when he didn't answer. The best course now was to be overbright and act as if no surprise decision of his could faze her. Maxwell smiled behind the dark spill of hair that fell into his eyes. You think I live in the main house? Come on. Lena followed, her curiosity completely overcoming any previous worries she may have had about being separated. Of course Maxwell lived in the farmhouse, didn't he? Where else was there besides the bunkhouses? He led her into the barn and up a flight of steps that wound around the first-floor office. Lena ascended, not bothering to disguise her amazement as they went. Maxwell, you live out here? Since I started high school, he said amiably as he set her things down to unlock the door to his apartments. Are you telling me you were literally raised in a barn? Give it a chance, Maxwell said, wearing that same mysterious smile as he pushed the door open for her. Something tells me you're going to like it. Lena didn't bother stifling her gasp, or even pausing before she swept past him into the front room. Because it wasn't just a room that Maxwell inhabited. The spacious studio layout she had been expecting gave way to countless other rooms. The slanted ceiling reminded her of walking into a friend's A-frame house she had once visited and fallen in love with. Rich chestnut wood floors and walls seemed to wrap her in a cozy embrace and immediately made her forget the reality of where they actually were. Walking into Maxwell's apartments felt like coming home. Maxwell, this is amazing, she whispered. She turned and was startled to find that, unlike her, he wasn't taking in their surroundings at all. His eyes were steadfastly trained on her and on what Lena assumed must be her totally transported expression. She was a little embarrassed by her breathless response, but seeing the resulting pride on his face made it worth it. Not a lot of people would think so, he admitted. Especially not anyone you're likely to find on the dating scene. You're the first woman I've ever had up here. No. Yet she believed him and was secretly ecstatic to have been chosen. Oh yeah. But I'm glad I made the choice. Just look where living above the barns growing up got me. I have a solid job with great horse stock. Maxwell flared his hands in unnecessary presentation. As far as Lena was concerned, the entire everyday operation of Cooper Ranch was already a testament to his success. The barns were always close to family, but living here gave me independence too. A man after my own heart, Lena said. Then she felt embarrassed for bringing her heart into it. She looked away, ostensibly to keep exploring, but she was aware of Maxwell's eyes following her all the while. Are you sure having me this close isn't going to bother you? I can't promise it won't bother me, Maxwell said as he crossed the room. He opened the door to what Lena assumed was to be her bedroom. But I won't be bothered in the way that you're suggesting. The devil in her wanted to press him about what he meant, but Lena had always thought it a distinctly unattractive look to play dumb. She knew exactly what he meant by his words, because she was about to be bothered by their proximity as well. Hot and bothered. At least she wouldn't run up the electric bill by taking steamy showers. It was cold. 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 From here on out. Maxwell stepped nearer to her. They had been so wrapped up in business and trying to get out ahead of this baby thing that Lena only just now realized they hadn't had time to discuss the future of their relationship. Was a real romance between them possible, given the crowd of matters already jostling for space? The taste of Maxwell's kiss still lingered on her lips. Lena touched the pliant flesh of her lower lip, just to be sure she was imagining the feeling, and to apply a little pressure, just a little, to the memory. Maxwell watched her. She could act on her desire and pull him to her, but she still hesitated. Would she be pursuing what her heart wanted? Or was it just hormones maddening her with images of him pinning her against every available surface of the apartment and having his way with her? I'll just start unpacking now, shall I? Lena suggested. If she didn't use words to preoccupy her lips, she was likely to seize his. Maxwell blinked, then ducked his head in a nod of affirmation. He moved aside to allow her to deposit her duffel on the bed. When Lena turned, he was already gone to retrieve the rest of her belongings from the truck. Oof! She exhaled, rolled her eyes to the ceiling, and collapsed back onto the bed. If Maxwell wanted her close, it was possible he underestimated just how close she wanted him to be. She eyed the switch plate on the wall. The first thing she would do once she unpacked was replace it with the one from her old house. You sure know how to make a girl feel special, Maxwell, she mumbled to the ceiling. Lena was starting to feel at home already. Chapter 8. Maxwell spent the next week teaching her all about his horses. The doctor had forbidden Lena from some of the more physical work to be done around the ranch, so she threw herself wholesale into her lessons. The horse she'd paused to admire when she'd first arrived, a gorgeous black and white paint with the dished face and high tail of his Arabian ancestors, was Maxwell's pride and joy. The horse he planned to sell to the Middle Eastern princes. Arctic Fire, Monkey Mad Dog, Whispered Faith. She rattled off the names on the list quietly to herself as she walked through the sunlit barn. Jesus, Maxwell, you sure know how to name your stock. Either that, or you don't know how to name them at all. She should have this by now, but she felt hopelessly lost as she looked on the long equine faces staring back at her out of their stalls. She blamed pregnancy brain, but that didn't make it any easier. Maxwell had even taken to sending his friends and neighbors in unannounced to roleplay at being buyers. Lena had been dismayed by what she had first perceived to be a trick, but she was determined to win the game now. She never backed down from a challenge. She stopped in front of the horse she thought was Monkey Mad Dog. He pushed his nose out, and Lena stroked him as he whickered and nodded. She shut her eyes and leaned in. I am beautiful, she whispered. I am worthy. Her daily affirmations with the horses raised more than a few eyebrows around the barn, but Lena didn't mind it. She knew how ridiculous she looked, but the time she spent bonding was priceless. It put the horses at ease around her and made her that much more effective as a saleswoman. Hello? An unfamiliar male voice called out. Lena whirled. Not another one, Maxwell, she moaned beneath her breath. She composed herself, squared her shoulders, and strolled to meet this latest client. "Hello." She beamed her most eager smile at him to make up for the time it had taken her to cross the barn. He was a handsome older gentleman in a muted camel-colored cowboy hat and well-worn boots. She liked the look of him instantly. Once the game was over, she would have to introduce herself to him without pretenses. "I'm Lena. Lena Fudge." She extended her hand. "Can I help you?" He introduced himself, and Lena immediately forgot the man's name. Her dumb brain probably filed it away accidentally with all those ridiculous horse names, and, well, she wasn't about to ask him for it again. He was soft-spoken and genial as they toured the barn. He was looking to make a purchase, and had heard good things about the horseflesh down at Cooper Ranch. With or without that damn article in Rains, Lena thought mutinously. Weeks had passed since its publication, and Maxwell still couldn't let it go. "So you see, Miss Fudge, I was hoping to meet with Maxwell today to discuss adding one of his Quarabs to my stable." Lena's heart thudded excitedly at the way his eyes had lit up with delight. She could tell already that she had passed the test. "But after speaking to you, I'm ready to make my purchase today. This one here." He indicated. "Who was that?" whispered Faith. Lena went with it. "You and Whisper there sure did seem to hit it off. Why don't you follow me back to the office and I can draw up the paperwork?" She still needed practice arranging the forms the way Maxwell liked them. The client continued conversing with her as they took over the office, and she poured him a cup of coffee. She had just sat down when Maxwell entered the office. "Grant?" he questioned. "What are you doing here?" "Grant." Lena could have smacked herself, but no one needed to know how bad she was with names. Seeing Maxwell, she threw up her hands and spun around in the office chair. "I win!" she crowed. "Oh yeah? Who's the best saleswoman around?" Maxwell stared at her in horror. Grant, at least, looked amused, if not a little bit perplexed by her reaction. Taking in their expressions, Lena began to slowly deflate. In fact, she suddenly suspected that deflating wasn't good enough. Better to disappear into the floor entirely. "He's not..." She mouthed her question at Maxwell and pointed to Grant as soon as his head was bowed over the contract. Maxwell shook his head once, very deliberately, and Lena's blood ran cold. Oh God. Had she actually just made a real horse sale while thinking it was all a game? Grant? Do you mind if Maxwell glances that contract over real quick before you sign?" "Sure." Grant passed the contract back behind him. Maxwell smoothed a hand down his face in obvious distress, but kept his expression carefully composed. His eyes flickered down the length of the page, and some of the tension started to ease out of Lena when she saw him beginning to relax. Was she going to pull this off, after all? Then all the blood drained out of Maxwell's face, and she knew she had made a royal fuck-up. Whispered Faith? "You want to buy Whisper, Grant?" Maxwell sounded like he was about to be seasick in the dead middle of Montana, whispered Faith. Lena nearly gasped aloud as the name clicked into place. That was Maxwell's prize horse that he intended to sell to the Arabs. And just like that, her mistake suddenly put new meaning to the phrase royal fuck-up. "Oh, great catch, Maxwell." Lena pulled the contract breezily out of his hand. "We'll correct that, no problem. The horse Grant wanted was..." She glanced at the diagram she'd drawn up with each horse's name scribbled in their assigned stall. She needed the horse next to Whisper. Arctic Fire. Even if she couldn't get the names right, Lena had known exactly which horse was off limits to potential buyers. Even if she had nearly just sold him by accident anyway. Grant chuckled and shook his head. "You should try naming your horses like a normal person, Maxwell. I'll keep that in mind." The correct sale was made, and at the end of it, Grant shook Lena's hand. "I'll send my boys by with the trailer in the morning. You have a real jewel on your staff, Maxwell," he commended on his way out. "Fancy names aside, this woman knows her horses. Careful I don't come by next time with a job offer to hire her out from under you." "We're always careful around here," Maxwell responded. Lena flushed and picked at a thread on her flannel shirt. "You take care." As soon as Grant was gone, Lena turned back to Maxwell. She knew her elated expression had frozen on her face, Her brain still didn't know whether or not it was appropriate for her to feel this much excitement, not when she had almost messed up so royally. But the key word most applicable here was almost, as far as she was concerned. Not only had she not sold the wrong horse, but she had also just made her first sale. "I'm sorry for the close call," she said eventually. She let her smile tug itself a few degrees smaller as she looked at him in sympathy. "You okay?" Maxwell let out a gusty sigh and let his big body fall back against the barn wall. He removed his hat and held it in place over his heart. "But you see, Maxwell." Lena took advantage of his silence to lean in with a grin. "The hard part's listening, and you've already got that down. Now you just have to learn to go with your gut and roll with the punches. You tell the other person what they want to hear and—" Maxwell snatched the front of her shirt and dragged her in. Lena's surprise was muffled by the hot, insistent lips that both claimed and silenced hers. She fell against him eagerly, enthusiastically, and Maxwell's back hit the wall harder. His Stetson fell to the dirt floor as their lips went to war. It was as if every breath she exhaled, Maxwell was determined to inhale. He didn't want a spare inch of her escaping the dominating dance of his mouth. She moaned as they forced themselves together as close as possible. The kiss was so intense that it felt like only the spare inches of her belly kept them from becoming one in that moment. Maxwell broke away first, with a gasp that was clearly meant to suck oxygen back into his lungs. Lena panted in what felt like agreement. A corkscrew curl fell across her nose, but she didn't want to take her hands off him long enough to fix it. "So? Do you forgive me?" "Nothing to forgive." Maxwell sighed as he folded her in against him. Lena lost herself in the warmth, the solidity, of his chest. The comforting pulse of his heart began to stir something in her that wasn't just affection. It was inspiration. "I was just thinking that a sale shouldn't be this stressful." Maxwell sighed again as Lena drew back. "And I was just thinking your chest has given me a brilliant idea," she concluded. Chapter 9. Okay, so maybe it wasn't a brilliant idea. It was a super brilliant idea. And it was one Lena knew she couldn't bring Maxwell in on. What Maxwell didn't know wouldn't hurt him. And in this case, it could only help their sale. Lena peeked out from behind the Cooper Ranch trailer to take in the scene. It was the second day of the big horse sale, the day after the buyer's preview, kicking off 2 fun-filled weeks of horsey festivity. The air was filled with dust thrown up by incoming trucks and galloping hooves. Buyers and sellers conversed with animated gestures as the more curious, casual browsers moved about the stables and temporarily erected pens. It was an ocean of cowboy hats as far as the eye could see. Lena yearned to get into the thick of it, but not yet. She had to set her plan into motion first. In the crowd of hats, a group of tall, dark men moved about in dark suits. They were snappily, impeccably dressed for the occasion, exuding a class and attitude completely exotic to the Montana countryside. The Arab princes weren't a disappointment. That was for sure. For the first time, Lena felt intimidated by the idea of engaging with them. Thankfully, they weren't her target. Their female companions, wives, followed behind them dutifully, gorgeous dark-eyed women that moved with all the grace and elegance of supermodels. In fact, Lena wasn't sure that half of them weren't. "How's it going?" Maxwell came up beside her, making her jump guiltily. She turned to him. He had shed his shirt, and his tanned, muscled body glistened with a sheen of sweat. "I couldn't have oiled you up any better myself," she thought mischievously. But she couldn't let on to her plan. Not yet. "It's going better than expected," she admitted. "We've attracted interest from buyers from Kentucky, California, Scotland, and Ireland." "But still no Arabs." Lena shook her head. "Still no Arabs." Maxwell growled in frustration and returned to work. He was clearly taking out his feelings on the matter through hard physical labor. The horses watched as he rejoined them, swishing their tails curiously. Lena had to resist the urge to rub her hands together gleefully. Harder to resist was the desire to watch as he took up his rake and started spreading fresh straw around the pen. There was no denying Maxwell was stacked. She had already lost count of the women who stopped with their mouths hanging ajar as he obliviously carried on working. Lena liked to think of it as the Henderson Farm effect, and she was banking her sale on it now. Her moment came when the wives broke off from their princely husbands to purchase iced tea at a nearby stand. Lena scurried as fast as she could back to Maxwell. She entered the pen and shoved the handsome horseman forward. "Maxwell, do you mind cleaning over here for a bit? The smell is driving me crazy." She nudged him a little more toward a patch of sunlight penetrating the cloud cover above. "Yep. Right there." He glanced at her curiously. "Yeah, sure thing, Lena. Sorry to be a taskmaster." She made a big show of fanning her face and pinching her nose. "It's the pregnancy. It's given me mutant powers. I swear I can smell the manure drop from all the way across the fairgrounds." Maxwell surprised her by dipping down for a kiss. Electricity ignited within her and raced through her veins all the way down to her toes. As they broke apart, the heavy look he gave her made her weak in the knees. It was obvious what was on his mind at that moment, and for the first time that day, it wasn't the Arab princes. Lena blinked rapidly to break herself out of the spell. She turned and let herself out through the gate. The women had finished at the tea stand and were just winding their way back toward their husbands. "Oh, that looks delicious!" she exclaimed. The women stopped and exchanged looks. Lena pointed to their tea. "Sorry, I can't help myself. I get the craziest cravings." She touched her stomach. They all gazed at her baby bump, round-eyed and curious. They were young enough that Lena had to wonder if any of them had been through their own pregnancies. They wandered over, for the moment forgetting their husbands, and circled her. "Can I touch?" the one who appeared to be the youngest among them asked breathlessly. Lena grinned. "Of course. I don't mind at all." The women all took turns reverently petting her stomach. A year ago, the then flat-bellied Lena Fudge would have found the attention totally embarrassing, but she thought she understood the fascination better now. She didn't mind being reduced momentarily to a curiosity, because she definitely didn't plan on being the main event. She saw her opening the moment the eldest wife, a handsome, proud-nosed woman, looked up from her stomach and caught sight of Maxwell. Her cheeks erupted immediately in a rosy hue, and her impeccable self-possession seemed to crumble. She turned and whispered rapidly to her closest companion. One by one, the wives all fixed their attention on the shirtless cowboy laboring not a yard away. "Oh, are you interested in our prize pleasure, Quarab?" Lena emphasized, all the while batting her eyes innocently for effect. The women exchanged looks again, then practically tripped over themselves to agree that they were. "Follow me. I'd love to show him to you." Lena led the small procession over and was sure to give them a full view of Maxwell's naked back as they lined up along the pen. He was turned away from them and completely unaware of his audience. Nearby, Whispered Faith swished his luxurious black tail as he grazed. In defense of the horse's own beauty, Lena did notice the wives' eyes stray to him, and they crowed their approval. But Whisper was no match for his owner in this instance. Lena stepped back and fisted her hands on her hips. My work here is done, she thought. Well, nearly. It was only a matter of time before the princes came to collect their wives, and when they did, the women would have no choice but to use the excuse of their admiration of Whisper. Lena was confident the sale was in the bag. Maxwell straightened, wiped the sweat from his brow, and slapped his gloves on his thigh. The wives couldn't help themselves. They giggled shyly. He turned, his sweat-soaked hair falling in a tangle about his face. He flicked his head to get displaced and get a better look at his unexpected audience. His eyebrows furrowed in confusion, and the wide-eyed glance he threw Lena's way would make any woman want to take complete advantage of his naivete. Lena's mouth practically watered in that moment along with the other women's. Maxwell had absolutely no idea the effect his scantily clad presence had on those around him. Maybe most of the men touring the show wouldn't understand. But the thought hit her like a well-aimed baby kick. The men. She couldn't have Maxwell standing around like this when the princes arrived. She turned, hunting the crowd. Sure enough, she saw what suddenly seemed to be a legion of black suits winding their way toward the Cooper ranch pen. "Maxwell!" His name burst suddenly from her lips in a near shriek. Maxwell heard her, and was already running, practically vaulting the pen and racing by the swooning ladies to join her. Lena felt bad for inspiring his panic, but as long as his feet were moving, they had a chance of escaping. She waved him to follow her as she disappeared back around the side of the trailer. "What? What is it? Is it the baby?" Maxwell demanded. Lena glanced around the corner and quickly whipped back around to face him. This was bad. Their position wasn't secluded enough. One of the wives had even waved in their direction when she looked. She hunted around them before spotting the pile of fresh hay in a stall a few feet away. She hauled that direction. "Get down!" she whispered fiercely. She grabbed Maxwell and pushed him down into the hay like they were under fire, then closed the stall door. The sweet scent of the alfalfa erupted into the air around them as Lena laid herself down beside him. Perfect. From this position, nobody was likely to find them until they wanted to be found. "What the hell is going on with you?" Maxwell asked. But he was laughing, probably at the absurdity of this most recent string of events. He turned into her, in the same moment Lena turned into him, and her heart stopped. Their eyes met, and their gasping breaths began to slow. Maxwell studied her face as she let herself take him in. He had been laboring all day, but damn if he didn't smell nice. Her superpowered nose was suddenly working overtime when she realized she could smell the sharp spearmint of his aftershave. "Maxwell!" She was about to explain herself, but he caught her chin in his hand and bent to her. Lena exhaled an appreciative noise as his lips captured hers. This kiss was deeper and much more satisfying than the one he had surprised her with in the pen, but it also awoke all sorts of unfulfilled needs deep inside her. She felt herself growing wet already as he shifted onto her, and they sank into the bed of hay. Maxwell straddled her waist. "Sorry, readers, here's where we fade to black, due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book. Available from all major retailers." Lena dropped her head back into the haystack, touched her forehead, and blew a raspberry with her lips. She then shook her head to try and clear it. Already she could feel the heavy desire to nap tickling at the edges of her alertness. When Maxwell had caught his breath enough to withdraw, he grabbed his shirt and offered it to her to clean up. "No!" she said, laughing. She reached out her hand and clamped her fingers repeatedly. "My underwear! Get me my underwear! As you wish, princess." Maxwell handed back her lost panties, but his playful words snapped her back into the present. Lena sat up quickly. He was still straddling her. He sat back on his heels to make room, but appeared to have no intention of leaving. "Go on, get your shirt on and get out there." Lena giggled as she pushed Maxwell off her. "The Arabs are looking at Whisper." "The Arabs?" Maxwell seemed stunned as he went through the motions of buttoning his shirt up. Lena laughed and shook her head in dismay. "You missed a hole. Here, let me." Her fingers worked the buttons into their proper order, and she pushed him forward. "Knock 'em dead, cowboy." "I'm getting used to knocking things," he said devilishly as he pushed his dark hair into some semblance of order. "Knocking girls up, knocking boots. You're a beast." Lena shoved him again. "Someone should put you in a pen." Watching him go, she had total confidence that they had just clinched the sale. Chapter 10. A week later, a solo trip to the doctor's office brought with it unexpected news. As soon as she stepped out into the parking lot, Lena had her phone in her hand. Maxwell's contact info was already pulled up. He had work on the ranch today but instructed her before she left that morning to call as soon as her appointment concluded. Lena looked at Maxwell's picture staring back at her from the tiny glowing screen, and exhaled. The attempts she had been making to breathe were doing nothing to diminish her excitement. "Come on, Lena, you can do this. It's not like you knew, and it's not like Maxwell will expect you to have known." She dialed and pressed the phone to her ear. Each subsequent ring of Maxwell's cell bolstered her courage, and also gave her hope that he was too busy to pick up her call. Maybe this was the sort of conversation that was better to have in person. God, what if he thought she had cut him out on purpose? The alarming possibility occurred to her just as she heard the telltale click of an answer. "Hello?" Maxwell's familiar gruff voice answered, and Lena's heart ascended into her throat to choke the words off before they could come. She couldn't just lead with huge news like this. Could she? "Lena?" "I'm here," Lena chirped quickly. She jolted into motion and started for her car. "Just checking in. as requested. How's work going? It's going. The issuing silence was expectant, and Lena went on. Maxwell, I have some news, she began. She paused before getting into her car and leaned up against the door. She crossed her left arm over her distended belly to prop up the right and keep the phone pressed firmly to her ear. This appointment wasn't the one I expected to have today. I guess I'm further along in the process than I thought. I mean, not further along in the pregnancy. God, can you imagine if I had no idea how pregnant I was? Lena, Maxwell interrupted, patiently guiding her back to the point of her call. Lena exhaled again. Okay, all I'm saying is, I had no idea what today was. What is today? The day you find out you're going to have a daughter. Lena clenched her eyes shut, trying to hear any hint of what his reaction might be. A hitched breath, an exclamation of surprise too far from the receiver for her to make out his exact words. Hell, even the whispered whoosh of a fist pump would have made her melt down the side of her car and puddle on the pavement with relief. Today was the day they learned the gender of their baby, and Maxwell hadn't been there to process the news with her the moment it was delivered. Lena had been taken aback herself when the doctor, ultrasound wand held steadily against her belly, had asked if she wanted to know the baby's sex. But she felt certain this sort of thing wasn't uncommon. It was totally fine for one parent to inform the other of this news, right? Right? Maxwell? She was starting to get nervous. Silence answered her from the other end of the line. Lena pulled the phone away from her ear to make sure she hadn't somehow muted the call or hung up on him by accident. The numbers denoting the time she had spent on the call continued to tick by steadily. Maxwell, are you there? I'm here. Lena's straining to hear every detail of the action back at the barn paid off then. She heard Dennis's muffled voice address Maxwell with a muted concern, and Maxwell responded to him. Surely the major reveal of the gender of their child would have inspired a moment of drama, even in the grizzled old stable hand. They had to be discussing something else, something work-related. Hey, Lena, I'll have to call you back. Maxwell's voice returned only long enough to forewarn of longer separation. Oh, of course, I understand completely. Lena nodded, then realized what a fool she was being. Maxwell couldn't see her bobbing up and down like a city pigeon. She cleared her throat, turned, and dropped her key. Shit, she muttered, as she struggled to stoop down to fish for them. Lena? I'm fine. Tiny, hot pinpricks stung the corners of her eyes in seeming rebellion against her words, but she ignored them. I gotta go. Lots to do. Lena? He asked again, but she hung up before he could continue any inquiry. What more was there to say? They were busy people. Busy, busy, busy. She had intended to drive straight home to Cooper Ranch, but suddenly the ranch seemed like the last place on earth she wanted to be. Lena didn't even consciously register where she was driving until she turned the last corner and pulled into the driveway. By then, the tears were pouring freely down her face. In complete contrast to the scene her face was making, her breathing was surprisingly steady. She got out of the car just as her grandmother pushed open the front door. Lena, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you all the way out here, hun? Grandma Fudge was spending the next few weeks in Montana with a family friend until the house in Florida was squared away. Hi, Grandma, just thought I'd stop in. Her face was a hot, runny mess. Grandma took one look at her and pulled her into a hug so fierce Lena had to bend her back and hunch down quickly to accept it. Grandma Fudge was tiny, but she was formidable. Lena, darling, what on earth happened to you? What's wrong? Grandma took her hand and led her to the porch swing. Lena waved off the older woman's concern and quickly brushed her eyes dry with the back of her hand. Nothing, Grandma. Nothing's wrong. I'm just happy, that's all. I got some good news today I wanted to tell you myself. The hugs came in endless supply as soon as Lena showed her the printout of the ultrasound. Her grandmother was so completely elated by the news that she forgot to question Lena's dubious personal presentation further. That's it? Grandma slapped her thin, jeans-clad knees and rose from the swing as if she couldn't sit anymore. I'm calling your mother. Easy, Gran. Even I haven't called her yet to share the news. I'm not calling her to share your news, hun. I'm calling her to make news. She threw her head back and crowed a bright laugh that made Lena jump with surprise. No more Florida for me. I've decided to stay right here. Montana. I'm going to take care of you and the baby. Grandma, Lena said wearily, I don't think you've thought this through. Oh, pish-posh, Grandma interrupted. I've been thinking about it more than you suspect, Lena, honey. My mind's made up. And you know how mulish Grandma gets. If you're going to talk about yourself in the third person, I think great-grandma would be more appropriate, Lena said. Her grandmother gave another short burst of ecstatic laughter and dragged her in for another hug. Lena clutched her. Suddenly, she had never needed a hug so desperately in her life. The ranch was her next and final destination of the day. There was no hope for it. As Lena pulled up the dirt driveway and got out, she started to talk herself up again, this time out loud. Come on, Lena, hun, she muttered, adopting her grandmother's affectionate tone as she tried to reason with herself. Let's be practical, girl. You never expected Maxwell to suddenly jump on board with you and adopt a ready-made family. She snorted to show herself just how unserious the fantasy was. You always planned on moving out at some point, she continued as she entered the barn and started up the steps to their apartment. She kept her voice low so as not to alert any wandering stable hands to her mental unraveling. She couldn't afford to start a rumor that she talked to herself. But then, it would just be one more bit of hot gossip to add to her pile. Would she even notice at this point? The door to the apartment was cracked, and the light was on in the front room. Lena froze and breathed in until her chest was almost as big as her belly. There was no hope for it. This was the right solution for everyone involved. She pushed her way inside. Maxwell, I've come to a decision. I'm moving out. Grandma Fudge was spending the next few weeks in Montana with a family friend until the house in Florida was squared away. Hi, Grandma, just thought I'd stop in. Her face was a hot, runny mess. Grandma took one look at her and pulled her into a hug so fierce Lena had to bend her back and hunch down quickly to accept it. Grandma Fudge was tiny, but she was formidable. Lena, darling, what on earth happened to you? What's wrong? Grandma took her hand and led her to the porch swing. Lena waved off the older woman's concern and quickly brushed her eyes dry with the back of her hand. Nothing, Grandma. Nothing's wrong. I'm just happy, that's all. I got some good news today I wanted to tell you myself. The hugs came in endless supply as soon as Lena showed her the printout of the ultrasound. Her grandmother was so completely elated by the news that she forgot to question Lena's dubious personal presentation further. That's it? Grandma slapped her thin, jeans-clad knees and rose from the swing as if she couldn't sit anymore. I'm calling your mother. Easy, Gran. Even I haven't called her yet to share the news. I'm not calling her to share your news, hun. I'm calling her to make news. She threw her head back and crowed a bright laugh that made Lena jump with surprise. No more Florida for me. I've decided to stay right here. Montana. I'm going to take care of you and the baby. Grandma, Lena said wearily, I don't think you've thought this through. Oh, pish-posh, Grandma interrupted. I've been thinking about it more than you suspect, Lena, honey. My mind's made up. And you know how mulish Grandma gets. If you're going to talk about yourself in the third person, I think great-grandma would be more appropriate, Lena said. Her grandmother gave another short burst of ecstatic laughter and dragged her in for another hug. Lena clutched her. Suddenly, she had never needed a hug so desperately in her life. The ranch was her next and final destination of the day. There was no hope for it. As Lena pulled up the dirt driveway and got out, she started to talk herself up again, this time out loud. Come on, Lena, hun, she muttered, adopting her grandmother's affectionate tone as she tried to reason with herself. Let's be practical, girl. You never expected Maxwell to suddenly jump on board with you and adopt a ready-made family. She snorted to show herself just how unserious the fantasy was. You always planned on moving out at some point, she continued as she entered the barn and started up the steps to their apartment. She kept her voice low so as not to alert any wandering stable hands to her mental unraveling. She couldn't afford to start a rumor that she talked to herself. But then, it would just be one more bit of hot gossip to add to her pile. Would she even notice at this point? The door to the apartment was cracked, and the light was on in the front room. Lena froze and breathed in until her chest was almost as big as her belly. There was no hope for it. This was the right solution for everyone involved. She pushed her way inside. Maxwell, I've come to a decision. I'm moving out. Chapter 11. Maxwell turned as he heard the door to the apartment push open. A word of greeting was on his lips, but Lena beat him to it. I'm moving out. Maxwell stared at the curvaceous figure in the doorway. Outlined by the late afternoon light filtering in through a window, he thought she looked like an angel. He supposed not all visitations were meant to convey good news and happy tidings. Move out. He hated how bewildered he sounded repeating the words. Why? When? His head spun. This was not what he had prepared for. Lena looked taken aback by his surprise, but her expression grew resolute. She walked into the room and took his hand. It's okay, Maxwell. You don't have to pretend like this isn't the right thing. Who says this is the right thing? He demanded. Who the hell could Lena have been speaking to make her think this? Did somebody get to her after they got off the phone? The phone call. Maxwell could kick himself. As Lena hunted his eyes for some explanation he couldn't yet form, he realized that he had probably screwed up. Their phone call that morning must have been the moment he steered things south. But try as he might, Maxwell couldn't think what he might have done to drive her away. He had barely said a word to her. Maxwell, it's obvious you're having second thoughts about all this. Lena's hands clenched over his. It's okay. In stark contrast to her reassurances, her eyes began to brim over with tears. Worse, he noticed now that her face was already red and slightly puffy, as if she had been crying all through her drive home. It's okay to not be okay with this, Maxwell. What are you talking about? He asked her. Lena, I don't want you going anywhere. I would be devastated if you did. Wouldn't know what to do with myself. But the words remained unsaid. He didn't know how to summon them to the fore to just tell her how he was feeling. Lena blinked. She drew back and looked at him as if she suddenly suspected she had found someone else in Maxwell Cooper's living quarters. But on the phone, you were distant. You barely said anything to me when I told you we're having a girl. I thought the news had changed everything. It doesn't change a thing, only makes it clearer. He stared at her, puzzled. Lena, were you worried that my silence meant I didn't want to have this baby with you? Lena looked away. Her brows drew together, as if she still couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Well, that made two of them. He knew this was a misunderstanding, and that he had likely caused it by being his usual taciturn self. Thankfully, Lena had arrived at precisely the right time. Wait here. Don't move a muscle, he ordered. Lena did move, but it was only to pull up a chair and settle into it as he crossed to the couch and brought his most recent purchases over to her. What is this? A gift? Lena blinked and was so surprised she accepted the box without any sort of protest. Open it, he encouraged. Lena paused, scrutinizing the outside of her present, before flipping the lid of the box open. She gasped, and her hands flew to her mouth. You left your Pinterest up on the office computer the other day, Maxwell explained. I didn't mean to pry, only all that pink is pretty eye-catching, so I went out today after you called to get you a little something. Maxwell had never seen Lena Fudge rendered speechless. Not when he caught her 5 months pregnant, not when she almost sold off his prized horse, and not even when the Arabs were being difficult. It was humbling that his gift to her now had the power to stop all words. Maxwell shifted around to look, and just to ensure that everything was in order. The adult pair of elegantly stitched pink cowboy boots lay exactly as he had positioned them. Nestled beside them in the box were their miniature twins. I got you a little something. And I got our daughter a little something. Maxwell, Lena trailed off as he knelt down in front of her and gently removed the scuffed pair of brown leather boots she always wore. He held out his hand expectantly. Lena laughed at the gesture. I feel like Cinderella, she concluded as she handed him the left boot. After she's become the princess, I hope. And not before. Maybe a little bit of both, Lena said. The amused smile that tugged at her lips was also slightly sad. The boots are amazing, Maxwell, but I don't know if they'll fit. Swollen feet and all. He hadn't considered that. He stopped halfway through guiding her foot into the boot. Lena's feet were adorable, but he could see now that her usual size wasn't going to work today. He carefully set the pink boot aside. Intuition told him it was better not to continue. She might be dismayed if they didn't fit her right away. Instead, he peeled her sock off and took her bare foot in both his hands. He began to rub deep circles into her sole, pressing hard and working his way along her arch. Lena sighed and let her head fall back. Okay, I do feel like a princess. Still want to move out? Lena bit her lip and shook her head. Maxwell felt himself begin to stir as he watched the way she dragged that plump red flesh between her teeth. He kept the massage going with one hand. He let the other trail up her leg, smoothing along the firm muscle of her calf and up her inner knee. She had worn a dress today to give the doctor better access, or so she had joked, before throwing a flirtatious wink over her shoulder and departing. Maxwell hadn't been able to come up with a clever response in time, but the memory of that wink had stayed with him. Now he knew exactly what he intended to do with it. His hand slid up beneath her dress to stroke the swell of her thigh. Lena grabbed his wrist and held his hand in place. For a split second, Maxwell thought she was only doing it to relish his touch, but when he looked up at her, her fearful expression wasn't what he had expected to find. "Should I stop?" he asked. It isn't that." Lena's eyes seemed to be pleading with him for something. Again, Maxwell wished he could read her mind. There was so much going on within them, between them, at all hours of the day, and it was as if neither of them knew how to begin expressing it. "I guess I'm just self-conscious. My body isn't the same as it used to be." She flushed. Maxwell was stunned. He hadn't realized her self-consciousness about the strange things pregnancy did to her body might extend to all of her. "Lena, you're beautiful," he told her seriously. "I think your new curves are mind-blowing." "Really?" Lena reached forward to brush a strand of hair out of his eyes. She looked into his expression for a long moment. Maxwell let her. He wasn't being dishonest. What he was going crazy with her luscious body right there beneath his fingertips. As soon as he felt her grip on his wrist loosen, his hand started to move again. "Really," he confirmed. "That's high praise coming from you," she said. "Something tells me you aren't a man who uses the term mind-blowing very often." She grabbed his hand a second time, but it was only to lead it upwards along the curve of her hip. "We should see if we can fix that," she whispered. His fingertips touched the lace of her panty line, and Maxwell exhaled. His cock throbbed once, hard, and he realized he was almost fully erect. Just seeing her in the doorway, even not knowing what he had done to incur the sudden shift in her mood, had been enough to get him rock hard. He hadn't been able to get any work done today, between thinking about the baby and their most recent tumble in the hay. Maxwell rose. He pulled her dress up with him. Lena laughed and playfully protested as he shed the gauzy fabric from her and tossed it onto the couch. He maneuvered around her and sat down in the chair. He kicked the bootbox aside and pulled her onto his lap, her back to his chest. The rustic old cabin chairs squeaked beneath their combined weight. "Maxwell, I'm not really sure." Lena trailed off, any further protests silenced by the rough palm that came up too. And, once again, sorry readers. Here's where we fade to black due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book. Available from all major retailers. "Well, that was mind-blowing," he suggested. His own orgasm still rolled through him in pleasant little aftershocks. Lena grinned. "If you do say so yourself." "I do. You're beautiful, Lena." They stared at one another for a beat. Then Lena blushed and looked away. She pushed his shoulder gently before turning to shuffle toward her room. "I'm going to take a bath in that big claw-footed monster you installed," she said over her shoulder. "Can I come?" Maxwell pushed himself to his feet. Lena paused in the doorway. Then, turning, she curled her finger toward him. For once, the silence between them said it all. It was an open invitation, and Maxwell would be damned if he missed out on it. Chapter 12. "And the Arabs still haven't made contact with you?" Jenny Malone asked him over the phone. Nothing, Maxwell confirmed. He pressed the cell closer to his ear as he scrolled through his emails. Not a peep from them since the horse sale. Jenny was a horse trader out in Colorado, whom he had connected with at a conference 2 years before. She was an older woman, silver-haired, with youthful eyes and an easy smile. Maxwell didn't detect the smile in her voice today, however. Its absence made him suspicious. He sat back in his office chair. You know something? Only what I've heard. Her reticence didn't bode well. On top of being an out-of-this-world trader, Jenny had a knack for parsing gossip in their world and pulling on the slender threads of truth. It was part of the reason Maxwell cherished their friendship. She was a straight shooter too, and the fact that she was clearly holding back meant it was best to brace for bad news. Tell me, he said. Jenny sighed. It's become quite a story, even all the way out here. Word is that woman you've got working for you on commission schemed to make you provocative enough to turn the heads of the princesses. Their husbands were not amused. That, coupled with the fact that you've got a chatty, independently minded pregnant gal working for you, turned them off the sale. Maxwell rubbed his face. Damn it. Lena must have come up in conversation between the princes and their wives. What am I supposed to do now, Jenny? Maxwell, who cares what the Arabs think? Jenny demanded. Seriously, kid. You've got some amazing horseflesh on your hands, and you know I wouldn't lie to you. You'll make the sale. Maybe this is just God giving you a sign you're going to make it to somebody else. How many other princes do you know wandering the circuit? Maxwell asked her with a bitter smile. His inbox dinged, and he shot forward in his chair. Hang on, Jenny. I'll call you back. Don't trouble yourself about it, Jenny said. Something tells me you just got good news, or at least the news you've been waiting to hear. I'll catch up with you next week, Maxwell. Maxwell hung up and stared for a long moment at his laptop screen. The princes had just emailed him. He summoned a deep breath and clicked it open. We about done here, Lena. Maxwell checked his watch against the clock on the barn wall. Almost finished, Lena agreed. She craned closer to whisper, placed a gentle hand on either side of his muzzle, and pressed her cheek to the bridge of his nose. Breathe with me, Whisper, in and out. I am an amazing horse. My coat is shiny and my gallop is mighty. I am sought after by princes. I will get all my defecations done before they visit, and afterwards I'll eat a bucket of my favorite oats drizzled in honey. I deserve every good thing that comes to me. I'm going to make Daddy proud. Maxwell exhaled impatiently and checked his watch again. Lena was laying it on a bit thick with the affirmations today, but she insisted on going through them before every potential buyer came calling. Maxwell, as impatient and annoyed with the whole procedure as he was feeling, was also superstitious. If Lena insisted it needed to be done, then he wasn't going to get in her way. There! Lena patted Whisper's nose as she drew back. That wasn't so hard. Gravel popped in the driveway outside, signaling the arrival of the prince's limo. Maxwell darted a glance toward the door, then grabbed Lena's shoulders and started to steer her out. I need you to make yourself scarce, he said. No time to explain. Lena dug her heels in and threw her weight, and their daughters, back against him. Maxwell, what the hell? You make them uncomfortable, he exclaimed. He knew immediately he shouldn't have said it. Lena wheeled, her eyes huge in her head. What are you saying? Are you saying that I need to go hide somewhere? What are we, 3 years old? Please, Lena, I'm begging you, just do it. Her incredulous expression crumpled, and Maxwell realized too late just how badly his behavior had hurt her feelings. She turned and departed out the back door just as the Arabs entered from the front. Maxwell turned and forced his game face to the fore. Good afternoon, gentlemen. That was her, no? One of the princes sneered. Who? Maxwell asked. They had exchanged 2 sentences and he was already feeling exhausted. The woman from before, another of the princes provided. The one who was pregnant. A ripple went through the small gathering. Maxwell forged ahead anyway. He went on and on describing Whispered Faith's various qualities as Tick led the horse out to be viewed. Maybe there was something to Lena's affirmations after all. Whisper stood stock still and appeared to be on his best behavior as the princes inspected him. Maxwell felt a pain in his chest as he glanced out the way Lena had exited. "Well, everything seems to be in order here," one of the princes said as he drew back. "All that remains is the matter of that woman." "What matter?" Maxwell asked tiredly. He ignored the look of outrage Tick shot him. "Different culture, different rules." "We don't want her involved in the sale," another prince, the eldest, based on his graying temples and beard, said. His tone brooked no argument. "It is inappropriate for a woman in her condition to be interacting in any way with us." "And if I refuse?" Maxwell asked. The first prince shrugged. "Then we walk, Mr. Cooper. It is that simple. We take our money elsewhere, to an American stable where the women are not so crass and immodest." The disapproving frown turned Maxwell's stomach. Lena dressed as conservatively as she always had. It was just her new curves that increased her cleavage and made every shirt suddenly revealing. He exchanged another look with Tick. He knew what his answer had to be, he just didn't want to say it. Chapter 13. Lena was used to getting stared at when she went out to the bar alone. She figured sideways glances from the male drinking population were to be expected. She was a young woman, seemingly out on her own and unattached. She couldn't blame them for being curious. But as she eased herself onto a stool at the bar, she realized the looks she was getting were distinctly different. Maxwell's unending sexual attention had given her a new appreciation for her curves, so she understood that the men around her might still be checking her out like they always had. But she could swear the look on the bartender's face was almost a glare. When she adjusted herself slightly on the stool, she also caught the expression on her nearest neighbor's face. He was a man maybe 10 years older than her, with a head of puckish, curly red hair and a substantive, wiry beard. He turned his bright blue eyes away from her, pursed his lips to whistle a low tune, and drank some of the foam off his Guinness. There were 2 other red-headed men lined up down the bar behind him. They leaned out a little to get a better look at her, then turned away to converse quietly amongst themselves. Lena couldn't pick up what they were saying, but she heard the faint lilt of Irish accents. Of course, she was pregnant. A bar was the last place any good Samaritan wanted her to be. But she had to drown her sorrows somewhere, didn't she? And this place had a brownie sundae to die for. "What can I get you?" The bartender had returned. He leaned against the counter and folded his arms. It was obvious he didn't plan on picking up an empty glass anytime soon. "I need ice cream." Lena met his stare and leaned in. "The double chocolate brownie sundae, please, with extra fudge." The bartender rapped his knuckles on the bar to signal he had her order, and turned toward the kitchen. "Oh, and your best mocktail, please," Lena called after him. It felt wrong to sit at a bar stewing emotionally without a drink to nurse. "Rough day?" She turned on her stool to see the Irishman beside looking at her again. Now that the bar had universally agreed that she was not to be treated as a pariah, she could see the curiosity in his eyes had returned. "Rough 5 months. You don't look a day over 3. Lena laughed and shook her head. "That's awfully nice of you. And hey, don't I know you from somewhere? You look familiar to me." The Irishman extended his hand. "Bill McMurphy." Lena Fudge. She accepted his hand eagerly to shake. "Yeah, I do know you. You were at the VIP buyer day at the sale last week." "And I know you," he said. "How could I forget a face like yours?" Lena laughed. "Are you sure it was just my face that was memorable?" Her mocktail, a virgin appletini according to the bartender, arrived first, and after she had explained the point of such a drink to Bill, which was to say, no point at all, they fell naturally into talking about horses. By the time her sundae arrived, Lena had almost forgotten her craving. She was conversing animatedly by this point, and it hadn't escaped her that the 2 other members of Bill's team were leaning in to listen. "I'm telling you, Cooper Ranch has exactly what you're looking for. You should come by sometime and get a closer look. I'm certain Maxwell would be more than happy to." A heavy hand settled on her shoulder, the weight of it silencing her mid-sentence. Lena turned around. "Maxwell! There you are. Speak of the devil." Maxwell looked hard into Lena's startled face. He was still trying to process every piece of this scene, and he wasn't sure he liked the scenario he was coming up with. Lena seemed awfully comfortable for a pregnant woman settled onto a stool at the bar. He couldn't process Lena's expression. There was residual anger and hurt, clearly reflected in her eyes, but the rest of her face was expressively happy. She was roping him into whatever conversation she had going, he realized. He had no idea what her scheme was, but there was clearly one simmering below the surface. "When Dennis said you went to the bar, I didn't believe him," he said. Lena motioned for him to take the seat next to her, but he didn't, not right away. His eyes cut to her neighbors. He had recognized them at once. They were the trio of buyers from Ireland. "Making friends?" "Heck yeah, I am." Lena saluted him with her sweet-looking drink. "Maxwell, this is Bill. Bill, Maxwell." They went through the introductions quickly, and Maxwell shook everyone's hand. By the time Rick returned to take his order, he could see that there was no way of extracting Lena from her impromptu meeting. He settled in to watch, all the while sitting on more than just the bar stool. The Arabs had given him their requirements, and he'd refused to meet them. They wanted nothing to do with the potential sale at Cooper Ranch. It was remarkable how desperately Maxwell wanted to break the news to her. She was his partner in this, and in more than just business. But a part of him couldn't help suspecting that if he'd just handled the whole thing himself from the beginning, he would have made the sale. And here she was, at it again with the Irish. As Maxwell watched her work the room, a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. Maybe his instinct to run to Lena and share the news was all wrong. The way she smiled and laughed and so liberally traded stories about what happened back at the barn, his barn, was something of an unwanted revelation. What if she does the exact same thing to me that she did to her last employer? One word that the Arabs were out, and offers for Whisper would drop precipitously. Maxwell watched that ready smile bloom again and again as she charmed the pants off McMurphy and his crew. She was completely unscripted, going with the flow of the conversation, talking so fast it was as if she was reciting an incantation to bespell them all. What assurances did he have that Lena would keep this business with the Arabs to herself? None, he realized. He had no assurance at all. Chapter 14. A week after the bar, Lena came running into the barn from the apartment shouting his name. Well, she didn't run exactly. Sprints were a bit beyond her at this point, but she jostled as fast as the belly would allow, and God forbid anyone get in her way. "Maxwell!" Maxwell closed the stall door on Dandy and couldn't hold back a smile as he watched Lena hurry toward him. She had seemingly overshot her mark. She nearly barreled into him. He held out his hands quickly to catch her by the shoulders before she bowled them both over. "Easy," he laughed. Things hadn't exactly been tense between them recently, but they were different since the Arabs came and went. Maxwell was preoccupied and tried his best to be attentive to all the matters that required his focus, but he just couldn't get the botched sale out of his head. It wasn't a lost cause, he kept telling himself. Not completely. He just had to find a way back in. "Maxwell, I have amazing news," Lena burst out. She didn't appear to notice that she had nearly taken them both out in the process of delivering it. She thrust several sheets of paper his way. Maxwell withdrew his hands from her shoulders to accept them. "What's this?" "Read it," Lena said excitedly. "It's an email that just came in 5 minutes ago." Maxwell's eyes scanned down the length of the page. He almost couldn't believe what he was reading. The dark printed words began to swim together as he got toward the end. Vaguely, he was aware of several of the stable hands pausing in their work to mosey over and hear the news. "It's McMurphy and his guys from Ireland," Maxwell said. "They've made an offer for Whispered Faith." "Uh-huh?" Lena nodded her head so enthusiastically that she jogged her hair clean out of the ponytail. "And they're offering more than the Arabs." "I noticed." Maxwell still couldn't believe the figure. He had initially thought it was a mistake until he saw it repeated on down the chain in an earlier email, and saw that Lena was the one who had suggested it. "All right." Tick whistled, removed his hat, and slapped himself on the thigh. The other hands exchanged grins, and soon joined him in a chorus of whoops. "Guys, come on!" Lena put up her hands and laughed as they pretended to make an exhausted effort to lift her. Weeks ago, Maxwell would have worried that their overacting the joke would hurt Lena's feelings, but she seemed to be taking it in stride. In fact, She looked completely comfortable with herself in that moment as she beamed broadly from ear to ear. "You did it, Miss Fudge. You got those Irish guys to buy Whisper?" Tick crowed. "Oh, it was nothing," Lena said modestly. "He's such a beautiful horse, he sells himself." She glanced sideways at Maxwell, suddenly shy, and he could see that she was trying to pull him in to be likewise adulated. The truth of the matter was, Tick was right. Lena had just pulled an offer on his best horse all on her own. When all eyes turned to him, Maxwell continued to study the email in his hand. Bill McMurphy, too, credited Lena fully with persuading his camp to buy. They'd gone to the second sale, but couldn't get Lena and Whisper out of their minds and were making a return trip. "I can't take the offer," Maxwell spoke, and it was as if some other entity who wasn't him worked his mouth. "I need to sit on it." "What?" Lena's expression was too alarmed to be properly crestfallen. Tick and the others stopped mid-congratulation and stared at him bewildered. "Why not? I need to sit on it," he repeated. Tick chuckled as if he had just told a joke and cast about with his eyes for some ally as he stepped forward. "Max, this is what we've been waiting for," he pressed. "What you've been waiting for, and it's a better price for Whisper than you could have imagined." Maxwell nodded as if he were taking this information to heart. In reality, his brain was already working itself overtime to guide the situation back to his original end goal. "I want to make this sale, Mr., and I want to make it to the Arab royals." He had never thought his goal ran the risk of being challenged by Lena. She looked at him, and it was almost enough to make Maxwell wonder if she could see into him far enough to know his thoughts. He wasn't beyond feeling ashamed of them, but he stuck to his guns. He had to have this. Otherwise, what was he? Exactly the sort of man that Write-Up and Rains accused him of being: privileged, soft, and incapable. "We shouldn't pull the trigger just yet," he said. "There's no need to act so fast on this. We've still got time before the buyers head home. I'm willing to wait them out." "You want me to tell them we're going to think about it?" Lena asked incredulously. "After all the talking I did?" Maxwell nodded. "This deal might be the leverage we need to bring the Arabs back to the table and pony up more than they were willing to part with." Pun intended. Nobody laughed at his joke, probably because he delivered it with the same severe expression he had worn since Lena came dancing into the barn with her email. Now, she reached out to take it back from him. Maxwell let the paper slip from his fingers. "I don't know if you're likely to get a better offer from the Arabs, Maxwell," she cautioned. "And that's assuming they're even willing to meet with you again." "They will," Maxwell said. He spoke with more confidence than he felt, but he was determined to lead and make them all see things his way. "We'll invoke the scarcity principle. Show them just how much they have to lose. You've opened up an amazing opportunity for us, Lena." "Yeah, and you should take it," Tick burst out. Dennis came forward and laid a silencing hand on his shoulder. The younger hand turned away and threw his hat down in the dirt. Maxwell decided to ignore the display. "Well, I suppose we could try for a bidding war," Lena reflected. Maxwell could tell some of the wind had come out of her sails, and his chest hurt to think he might have been the cause. But he had to do things his way. He had to snag the Arabs on this sale and prove himself once and for all. He wasn't just some green, two-bit Montana breeder who could be trifled with. He had a horse fit for a prince in his stable. "We all win." Maxwell nodded as he turned back to work. "So long as we get a sale." "So long as we get a sale," Lena repeated faintly. She stared at the email, at the offer, and turned to climb the steps back up to their apartment. Maxwell lost himself in work. He didn't want to think about the dejected expression he had just witnessed on her face. Chapter 15. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hosterman, but I simply can't part with Whisper for a barrel of whiskey," Lena told the gentleman from Kentucky for the umpteenth time. Gentleman was pushing it a bit. Frank Hosterman was a smarmy specimen, tall and rangy like any other cowboy, but with a distinct patronizing twist to his mouth and a cunning in his eyes that wasn't necessarily indicative of intelligence. Word about the Irish's offer on Whispered Faith had gotten out. Hosterman had come by the ranch unannounced to look Whisper over himself. And to insult all of us, apparently, Lena thought. She was good with people. But something told her 10 more minutes of this might put her over the edge into bodily violence. I offered to pay cash too, Miss Fudge. Hosterman reminded her with an insincere little smile. You offered to pay half of what Mr. McMurphy offered, Lena pointed out. Her eyes traveled to Maxwell as he moved across the barn. She knew she shouldn't be praying for him to save her. This was her job, but Frank Hosterman was seriously wearing on her last nerve. Why don't I let you think about it some more? Hosterman suggested. He tipped his hat to her, smiled smugly, and strode off. As soon as he was out of earshot, Lena heaved a massive sigh and put a hand to her forehead. She didn't exactly have a headache, yet, but she could feel one coming on if she didn't call it quits for today. Maxwell came around the corner. Lena paused, leaning against one of the stall doors to watch his shadowed figure in the falling light. She couldn't make out the details of him, but just witnessing the stateliness of his muscled profile moving about was enough to fill her with an overwhelming sense of joy. She really cared for him, no matter how they might argue over things. A certain four-letter word had been intruding more and more on her thoughts recently, but she couldn't quite bring herself to say it out loud. Not yet. She noticed then that Maxwell was limping. Lena's brows drew together as she crossed the barn to join him. Maxwell? Did you hurt yourself? No. He waved his hand as he sat down laboriously on an overturned barrel. Not today, anyway. It's an old injury from a riding accident years ago. He leaned forward to massage the muscles around his left knee. Lena pursed her lips, then she reached out to take his hand and drag him back off the barrel. You're done working today. Come on, I know just what you need. 10 minutes later, she had drawn a bath for them in the clawfoot tub. Fragrant steam rose off the surface of the sweet-smelling water. She had snuck in a scoop of spearmint and lavender Epsom salts and curled along the ceiling. Lena lit a few candles, cracked the window open to help with the condensation, and began to slowly strip out of her clothes. She was sore and exhausted from being on her feet all day. She could only imagine how Maxwell must be feeling. When she lifted her head, she saw him standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He seemed almost reluctant to enter. Lena couldn't help the affectionate smile she felt form at the sight. She took his hand again and led him into the steamy room with her. She unbuttoned his shirt and pushed it off his shoulders slowly, sensually, before moving on to unfasten his belt. She could feel the heat of his gaze as he watched her work. You don't really know how to relax, do you? She asked, almost rhetorically. Cooper men don't know the meaning of the word, he confirmed. Then allow me, a fudge woman, to show you. They eased down into the tub, one after the other, and arranged their bodies until Lena sat comfortably between Maxwell's stretched-out legs. She had thought her belly might prove cumbersome, but Maxwell reached his arms around her and kept his hands on it. Lena thought she had never known the definition of the word luxury before this moment. Again, the four-letter word teased the tip of her tongue. She put it out of her mind. She wanted to relax with Maxwell, not jar him with an unexpected confession. Is this what you always wanted to do? She asked instead. Breed and sell horses? Didn't you ever want to go to college? I don't see the need for it, to be honest. Maxwell shrugged, naked skin sliding against her own. Not in my life. My brothers both went, but something told me it just wasn't the right thing to do to achieve my dream. What about you? Lena sighed and sank back against him. I sort of envy you. I was never in a position to go myself. I always wanted to. His arms tightened around her. And now? Do you still have that dream? She wondered if telling him the truth, that yes, until 5 months ago she had very much intended to follow her dream, would freak him out. Maxwell seemed to worry about her every time she happened to walk out of his direct line of sight. Lena blew a raspberry with her lips and gave her own shrug. Silly sounds helped her come to terms with the fact that her dream had aged with her, unfulfilled, and that it was probably beyond her reach now. Now I just hope to give my daughter the opportunity to chase her own dreams, she replied. Maxwell hugged her close. Me too, he whispered. Chapter 16. The Cooper Ranch team was getting antsy. Maxwell saw it, even if he didn't necessarily remark on it. No one approached him with their concerns outright, but the grave faces of his stable hands and the infrequency of light conversation spoke volumes around the barn. He was starting to wonder if he had a mutiny on his hands. He sat in his office that morning, and no one disturbed him. Lena was still entertaining prospective buyers, but they were just going through the motions at this point for appearance's sake. Whisper was going to the Arabs, plain and simple. Maxwell just wished the princes were back on board with his plan. They hadn't responded to any of his overtures since the offer from McMurphy became known. He rocked back in his chair with a sigh and combed his fingers through his hair. He was just pondering what to do next when Lena poked her head in. "Maxwell? Can I bother you for a second?" He felt his burden lightened immediately just by looking at her. Her hair was down today. Tousled, corkscrew curls spiraled free and framed her petite, button-nosed features. She glowed almost ethereally, standing there in the office door. And it wasn't just the morning sun gilding her curvaceous frame in breathtaking gold. She seemed to glow from within as well. Maxwell didn't like to think he was a man to be taken in by easy cliches. But there was definite truth to what they said about pregnant women. Lena looked radiant. "Bother away," he invited. He wished immediately it wasn't the response he had given. Why did he find it so hard to put into words what he felt for her? His natural stoicism had already troubled the waters between them. He knew he needed to work on it, but he still had trouble expressing just how he was feeling. Lavishing her with gifts was easier. "Well," Lena drawled, and scratched the side of her nose. "I kind of wanted to bother you for more than a second, actually." Maxwell craned forward with interest. Maybe he could use a break from all this Arab business, if only to refresh his brain enough to get back to it later. "All right," he agreed as he rose. "What are we doing?" Lena looped her arm in his and led him out the door. "You and I? We're going baby shopping." Lena steered her cart down the aisle. She was in a wonderland of toys. Blocks, rattles, plastic candy-colored musical instruments. In the next aisle over was a zoo of plush animals. Lena was pretty sure she had seen a pastel specimen of every creature Noah had supposedly loaded up on the ark, as well as every imaginable color of unicorn. "Okay, so when our daughter inevitably forms a Grammy Award-winning band in the future, do we want her to play guitar or keyboard?" Lena posed the question aloud as she considered the shelf of instruments again. When Maxwell didn't respond immediately, she turned to see if her joke had been as unfunny as it felt leaving her mouth. Maxwell was nowhere to be found. Maxwell? She scanned the aisle in vain, wondering if he had somehow got lost among the shelves. She ditched their cart momentarily to peek around the corner. Maxwell was still in the last aisle, turned in toward the unicorns. His head was bent, and she could see that he was holding his work cell up to his ear beneath the brim of his hat. Lena's heart sank. She willed it to re-elevate itself as Maxwell got off the phone. By the time he turned around, she was smiling again. "Good news?" she asked as she crossed to him. "The Arabs might be back at the table," Maxwell said. His handsome face looked pained. Lena blinked, but summoned her courage for whatever bomb was about to drop next. "On what condition?" she prompted. "On the condition that you aren't involved." Maxwell looked quietly devastated to have delivered the news, but there was no way his emotions on the matter compared to hers. Her mind raced a mile a minute as she tried to reconcile the possible sale with the statement the men involved were making about her. "I'm sorry, Lena," Maxwell said. "It's a different culture than ours. No, I got that." She gave a faint laugh in an attempt to play it off, but the sound came out cracked and cobweb thin. "And I really screwed up by objectifying you, and working in my delicate condition. I don't mind being objectified, and I love your condition." Maxwell reached for her, but stopped himself, as if he wasn't sure he still had permission. Lena wasn't sure either. She wasn't sure how she felt about any of this. She had just wanted a break from the barn and a day out with Maxwell to plan their future. But what sort of future did she really want? Maxwell had promised her the commission from the sale, But did she really want to buy a home for herself and her future child using some of the prince's money? Even though her commission, at 15%, would give her enough for a down payment, it would feel tainted somehow. Unearned. They didn't want her involved, and she didn't want anything to do with a group of men who looked down on her. Royalty be damned. "I think I need a sundae," she said. Maxwell nodded. He put an arm around her, and they started for the door. She felt guilty for abandoning their cart. But who knew? Maybe it would still be here when they got back. If they came back. Something told her their fun day out had just drawn to a close. Chapter 17. A car door slammed outside. Lena glanced up from stroking Whisper, heart thudding in her chest. She heard a chorus of congenial, laughing voices as whoever was outside the barn approached. Judging by the Irish lilts, she thought she knew who. "Wait here," she told Whisper needlessly. The stallion was already secured in his paddock and not likely to leave her sight. Unlike Maxwell Cooper, he was good at keeping a schedule. Lena looked about frantically, as if Maxwell might step out of the barn office or rise from a pile of hay, perfectly composed and ready for this meeting. When he didn't magically appear like the genie she wished he was, she knew she was in trouble. She knew she was alone. Lena touched her stomach and breathed deep. By the time Bill McMurphy rounded the corner of the barn, she was all smiles. She waved to him and his two business partners. "Hey, Bill! Over here! Come say hello to Whisper!" Handshakes, small talk, and patted muzzles quickly morphed into something more. Lena's eyes tracked all around the barn. She smiled so wide she was sure she must be grimacing by this point. "We're willing to make the buy today, lass." Bill's bright blue eyes shone earnestly. "Is Mr. Cooper around?" "Number, I'm afraid he isn't. But feel free to show up at any moment and prove my ass wrong, Maxwell." "Our plane leaves in 48 hours, Bill said apologetically. "For us, it's now or never." Lena pressed her hand to her stomach, closed her eyes, and breathed in deep. Her thoughts swirled. Bill had just issued an ultimatum on his offer, but Maxwell wasn't here to weigh in. What would he say? The baby kicked. Lena opened her eyes in surprise. Her daughter kicked again, not enough to hurt, but enough to jolt her from her cycling fears and focus on the present. It wasn't just Maxwell on the line here. It was everyone, her and the baby included. She hardened her expression and looked up. "I'll prepare the paperwork." Said paperwork was drawn up and quickly signed. All she needed now was to find Maxwell and get his stamp of approval on their agreement, and Whispered Faith would be headed to the rolling, emerald-green hills of Ireland. Lena hoped to visit one day. What she would love more, in that moment, was to hunt down Maxwell Cooper and get him to sign off on Whisper's utterly enchanted fate once and for all. There was more green on the line than just the rolling hills of Ireland. When Maxwell proved not to be anywhere on the premises and didn't answer his cell phone, she spent most of the day pacing their apartment. The sun was just starting to set over the hills and bleed its coppery gold light through the trees outside when she heard the dogs start to bark excitedly. Lena looked out her bedroom window, and sure enough, Maxwell's pickup was pulling into the drive. It was now or never. It wasn't just his pride on the line anymore. The lives and futures of his staff depended on the sale, and so did her and the baby's security. Lena squared her shoulders and breathed in deep. She waited. When the door to the apartment opened, she rose from the bed and joined Maxwell in the living room. "Long day?" she asked, as she watched him remove his hat. He set some groceries down, and Lena noticed the 6-pack of beer and the subsequent 6-pack of non-alcoholic brews he placed on the counter beside it. Her heart tugged at the gesture. Why did she feel so guilty all of a sudden? She had to make him see. "Yep." Maxwell shouldered out of his coat and unbuttoned his shirt. He turned to her with a tired smile. "Drink with me?" He nodded to the groceries he had brought in. "Only if you let me make the toast." Maxwell fished out 2 bottles and used one to open the other. He passed her beverage to her first. "You got it. What are we toasting to?" "I made the sale," she blurted out. "To the Irish. They stopped by today and reiterated their offer, and I knew we couldn't refuse. Only, Bill said he needed the sale printed up today." She set her beer down and fetched the paperwork from the coffee table. When she returned with the manila folder holding the contract, she noticed Maxwell's dark locks were hanging down into his face and hiding his expression. He gazed off out the kitchen window, then held out his hand. "Let me see it." Heart thumping, Lena passed the papers to him. "There's still time to change anything you want, of course," she explained. "Bill was persistent, but I stood my ground. I told him no sale would be made without you." "I can't." Maxwell stared down at the piece of paper in his hand. Lena wasn't sure she heard him right. Didn't he see the figure Bill was offering for Whisper? She nearly leaned in to point it out to him, but in that moment, she suddenly had the feeling Maxwell wasn't seeing anything at all. "Why can't you?" she demanded in exasperation. "Maxwell, everyone on the ranch is counting on you to make this sale." "It isn't about the money." Maxwell set his beer down untasted and leveled his dark eyes at her. Lena returned his stare with a steely look of her own. "It isn't to you. But as I said, there are other livelihoods on the line here. Everyone is invested." "But I'm the only one who is truly invested," Maxwell interrupted her. Lena blinked, as stung as if he had just slapped her in the face. She stepped back as he raised his voice. "Lena, everyone else can walk away from this. I can't. I'm the one who owns this horse, and I'm sure as hell the one who will make the final decision here." "I can't believe what I'm hearing," she said incredulously. "Do you really think that's true, Maxwell? Do you really think you're the only one invested here? The only one who's worked for this?" Maxwell looked away. His dark hair fell in a curtain around his eyes, but Lena didn't need to see his expression to understand his assent. Her cheeks, her neck, belly, every inch of her grew hot suddenly in a helpless rage. It was better to feel anger, she thought, than to acknowledge her dread at what she was about to say. "If that's what you really think, then I guess there's nothing keeping me here but a commission I'm not going to get," she said. She took the contract from his unresisting fingers and dumped it in the trash. "If you stand by what you say, Maxwell, then I'm going to walk away. Right now." Her heart thudded, striking hammer blows only she could hear in the subsequent stillness. He wouldn't really let her go that easily, would he? He had to know this wasn't just about the sale anymore. This was about them. About him being able to see and value other people, value her as a person, not just the mother of his child. Maxwell said nothing. He had retreated back into his usual stony silence. Lena stalked to her bedroom to pack. She wouldn't let herself cry as the world crumbled around her. Not yet. She would wait until she was driving down the road and well on her way to her grandmother's new rental. Curse completed, she thought, as she stowed the beginnings of her new life away. Guess I never escaped it after all. Chapter 18. The Arabs were out, literally. Out of Montana, out of the country. It was 2 days since Lena's departure, and Maxwell sat in his office with his head in his hands. He had barely slept for the last 48 hours. When he wasn't trying to get a hold of Lena, he had been trying his damnedest to get a hold of the Arab princes. It was noon on the dot, and an email had just come in. The Arabs were already on a plane back to the Middle East. The Irish has gone silent. The asshole from Kentucky was still circling him, but now offering half his original price for Whisper, a quarter of McMurphy's offer and no whiskey to wash it down with. Most of the guys in the barn wouldn't even look him in his face since Lena left. It was all falling to shit. Maxwell has never felt like such a miserable failure in all his life. Thoughts of Lena flashed across his mind like meteors, sparking and dancing. He couldn't stop thinking about her and the baby. He had tried converting his persistent thoughts into action, but she wasn't picking up the phone. Maybe she wasn't ready to talk to him again just yet. He was completely alone in his newfound shitty situation. He understood all too well now that he was to blame for his trouble. He had made his bed, and now it was time to lie in it. Alone. Knock, knock. Anybody in here? Maxwell pried his fingers from his face and lifted his head. A bushy, red-bearded face poked its head in the door. "Bill?" he said in wonder. "Bill McMurphy? What are you still doing here? I confess I never expected to see you again. Not after how completely unaccommodating I've been," he thought. "Lena said you were headed back on a flight home today." "Ah. Bill nodded, then motioned to see if he might enter. Maxwell nodded and rapidly rose to pour the other man a cup of coffee. "Sorry to trouble you without an appointment. It was the little lass who convinced me to stay put a while longer, actually. Mind if I sit down?" "Please." Maxwell waved him into the office chair opposite his desk, and the two men sat down. Lena had been in charge of every major interaction with Bill from the start. Maxwell had to wonder what the other man must think of him. "You saw Lena?" He was surprised when Bill's face crinkled into a pleasant smile, and his blue eyes glittered. Bill laughed. "Of course. We went out and had Sundays together. I enjoy talking to her. Very personable woman." Maxwell bent his head as if he had been chastened. Bill continued on, seemingly without noticing. "It was in the course of talking to Lena that my plans really started to take shape. As you know, my brothers and I are filling up a series of castles-turned-hotels in Ireland." Maxwell nodded. He may have barely spoken to Bill personally while Lena courted him as a client, but he had done his research. "We've been hired to stock the locations with a unique mix of horses." Bill blew on his coffee and grinned. "And you know, Lena reminded me just how much your horse, Whisper, struck me the first time I saw him. What a gem. None of the other horses I've seen out here in America boast that same combination of conformation, beauty, and intelligence." Maxwell nodded. It wasn't just a compliment, it was the truth. "I'd like to put my offer back on the table, Maxwell." Bill leaned in. "If you keep breeding horseflesh of this quality, we're likely to return to buy from you in the future. These hotels are going to bring in a continuous string of wealthy travelers, and a lot of them are horse people. I'd also be more than happy to send any potential buyers your way in the future." Bill rocked back and grinned. "Between your breeding skills and that Lena's ability to sell, you can really be proud of the operation you're running here." Maxwell was stunned speechless. He set his own coffee down but couldn't arrive at any words to say. It was a single word that left his lips first. "Yes," he said. "Then, you have yourself a deal, Mr. McMurphy. I'm sorry it took so long to get things squared away." Bill rose, laughing and holding out his hand to shake. It was at least as big as Maxwell's own. "Don't trouble yourself any further about it. What's done is done, and I'm damn glad to have done business with you and Lena. How is she, by the way?" Maxwell couldn't stop himself from asking. Bill drew back to examine him, but the other man's expression was sympathetic. "She's a wonder. Told me she's staying with her grandmother on the other side of town. Says she's very happy to be there, but, you know." Bill scratched the wiry hairs of his chin. "That's the first time I think she's ever lied to me. Curious, isn't it? But I have a nose for this sort of thing. It's Lena's honesty that made me want to do business with her. And you?" Maxwell nodded. "Thanks. I'll fax copies of all documents pertinent to the sale over to your office back home." "Please do, and see to it that you win your woman back," the Irishman called as he exited the barn office. Bill McMurphy didn't have to tell him twice. Chapter 19. Lena was baking as if her life depended on it. Hours went by when she refused to tear herself away from the oven and stovetop. She poured ingredient after ingredient, mixing until her arm hurt and she had to trade hands. The dishes piled up in the sink behind her until she had a formidable mountain on her hands, but still she couldn't resist the compulsion to fill up ever more baking sheets and cake pans and pie pans, and she had already gone to the store to replenish ingredients twice. Grandma, of course, had something to say about that. Grandma always had something to say about everything. Lena wiped her forehead and felt the smear of flour track across her skin. She had pulled her curls back hours ago, but they continued to escape the confines of her hair tie. She knew she must look like a mad scientist, a crazy woman. She paused in her baking only long enough to lean back and glance through the doorway into the other room. Grandma Fudge was snoring peacefully in the cushy armchair, her attention, for the moment, neutralized. There was no way Lena was going to make it through these next few months, much less 18 years of her baby's childhood. Grandma was always there, always flush with advice, which was exactly what the panicked Lena had wanted, and what she now realized she didn't always need. But there was no switching off that faucet. The advice flowed and flowed, and the cookies and cupcakes practically baked themselves, It wasn't just a house that made a home. She realized that now. It was the people in it. And while she knew she could make a home with Grandma, she yearned for the chance to go back and fix things with Maxwell. Raising this baby on her own with help from her family, that's not how it was supposed to be. Not in her situation. Curse be damned. She wanted Maxwell by her side, in her house, wherever that may be, in her bed. Pregnant or not, her body ached without him. She loved him. She needed him. And she couldn't have him. Fate, and their own decisions, had seen to that. Somebody rapped on the screen door. Lena whirled, conscious of the tears pouring anew from her eyes, and quickly scrubbed them away with the back of her hand. She deposited more flour in the process, but there was no hope for it. She was a wreck. Whoever this visitor was, they might as well know it so they could decide whether or not they wanted to take themselves back off the porch and vanish down the driveway. She reached the door, and he was there. Maxwell? She wasn't certain he wasn't a mirage. The screen partially eclipsed and darkened the big outline of him, but there was no one else it could be. Lena toweled clean her hands and pushed the door open. Maxwell stepped back as she joined him on the porch. He removed his hat quickly and turned it between his hands. God, he looked good. It was so unfair. Lena felt like the Pillsbury Doughboy or the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. The light that went on in Maxwell's dark eyes when he saw her in all her glory told a different story, but Lena ignored it. She was in charge of her own narrative now. Wasn't she? What are you doing here? She crossed her arms over her stomach. It wasn't a protective gesture so much as a way to fortify her heart against reaching for him. I had to see you. Maxwell's intense stare folded, and he grinned shyly. Making anything with nuts? Lena snorted. He was clearly trying to endear himself to her again, but she wouldn't let herself relax. Not yet. I came by to tell you that I sold Whisper. The hat stopped rotating in his big hands. To the Irish. I'm here to give you your commission. You earned it. It was no use trying to guard her heart around him. She felt torn in two by his words. She wanted herself and the baby to have been the inspiration for his trip, but she knew wishing was a dangerous game. Oh? That's wonderful, Maxwell. I'm so happy. So happy to hear it. The tears started to flow again, and she didn't care. She didn't bother wiping them as they came. And suddenly, Maxwell's arms were around her. He cradled the back of her head as she buried her face in his chest. Even now, she couldn't let herself believe they were this close. He would go away again. And I should have followed your instincts from the beginning, Lena, he whispered fiercely. I let my pride get in the way of doing what was best for everyone. I don't have to play every role. I can let go and let everyone succeed. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that. Lena sobbed and shook her head, but he clenched her closer. I know I have no right to come here and hold you like this. Maxwell extracted himself and drew back, seemingly against his own wishes. Lena stood bewildered as he held her at arm's length. You were great at your job, Lena, but I don't want you back. What? The logic didn't register with her at first, but the emotional whiplash of his statement did. Maxwell didn't want her to come back. To work? To him? Was this just business then? Had seeing her tears only made him uncomfortable, only made him pull her in for a hug to get her to stop? I want you to follow your own dream, he said intensely. Even if it takes you away from me for a while. I want you to take the commission money and enroll in school. You want to go to college, Lena, and my situation, I'd only be holding you back. You've never held me back, Maxwell. Her mouth twisted in a tentative smile. You're the one who believed in me when no one else did. You're the one who makes me soar. There was a beat while he digested her words. With the baby? He trailed off, then started over. If you are going to go back to school, the baby might make that difficult. Yes. She wasn't going to beat around the bush with that one. But plenty of people have done it alone. You're not going to do it alone, Maxwell said. I'm going to be a father to our baby. and I'm going to support you any way you ask me to." Lena gazed at him. She could scarcely believe what she was hearing. She thought again that she must be imagining him there on the porch with her. How was it that Maxwell Cooper had appeared again in her darkest hour, taken her in his arms, and said exactly what she wanted to hear? Well, not exactly. "I love you, Lena Fudge," he whispered. "I love you, and I love our baby. Please let me be the man I was meant to be to you both." And there it was. Exactly the thing she wanted to hear. Maxwell touched his forehead to hers. Lena let her eyes fall shut as she relished their connection. They breathed in and out together as she committed his words, and this moment, to everlasting memory. "I love you too, Maxwell Cooper." Just when she thought she couldn't possibly manufacture more tears, they came. But it didn't seem to matter. Neither did the fact that Maxwell was getting flour on himself as he pulled her in against him one more time. Lena came, laughing, and hugged him close, even as her grandmother stirred within the house and called out to her. "Lena, is that somebody at the door?" Epilogue. "Maxwell," Lena said his name with clearly affected patience. "We aren't going to name our daughter Cedar." "What's wrong with Cedar Cooper?" It was their first day back from the hospital, and Maxwell had done his best to ensure that everything was nice and cozy for Lena and their new baby girl. The extra pillows and blankets he had made up their bed with now gave the impression of an enormous pink monster swallowing both mother and child. He set the mug of chamomile tea he had brewed for her beside her, and sat on the edge of the bed. "I have a cousin out in Colorado who says it's a semi-popular name, girl or boy, and it's alliterative," he said stubbornly. "It's not alliterative. On paper it is." Lena laughed and shook her head, before training her gaze back on their daughter. The little bundle fussed and turned in toward her mother. "See?" Lena said. "She doesn't like it at all. Don't use our daughter against me." "Oh, you know what's going to happen," Lena said. "I fully expect her to have you completely wrapped around her little finger before her first birthday. I have to get my licks in where I can. You guys will be ganging up on me before you know it." It was no use discussing the lengths Maxwell wouldn't go to secure his daughter's happiness. He wasn't certain there were any, and it was no use correcting Lena either. Their daughter already had him wrapped around her finger, as much as she had already earned the unwavering love and devotion of her mother. What about something like Petunia? Maxwell cocked his head. He was trying to remember what a petunia flower looked like. It was pink, like his daughter was. Right? "She isn't one of your horses, Maxwell," Lena Whisper exclaimed, although he thought she was loving their game. In fact, they had been debating names all morning on the car ride home from the hospital, and Maxwell was deliberately making his suggestions more and more absurd just to get a rise out of her. He was giddier than he could ever remember being. He felt almost as young as the bundle Lena cradled in her arms. Lola. He didn't know where the suggestion came from. It was as if his subconscious simply summoned the name. Lola. Lena gazed at their daughter, and Maxwell saw the spark of recognition in her eyes. Lola. "I don't know. It reminded me of Lena. I always thought your name was pretty. I think Lola is beautiful." Lena sighed. "Little Lola. What are we going to do with you? You're the whole world now." Maxwell watched her watch their daughter. He almost couldn't bring himself to say what he knew he had to say next. What if his calculation was wrong? What if he ruined the moment? He wanted to keep her close, and this could ruin not just the moment, but everything. He reminded himself of her grandmother's advice, way back at the beginning. If he reined her in too much, she would bolt. He knew now she'd come back to him. "Forgot to mention this came for you in the mail while you were in the hospital." Maxwell fetched the large envelope from the kitchen table and brought it in for her. Lena's eyes rounded. She looked to him, as if uncertain the package was somehow a continuation of his jokes. Despite his smile of encouragement, Maxwell knew his expression was probably gravely serious. The letter was from the University of Montana admissions office. "Okay," Lena said with a shaky breath. "It's probably just another sales pitch. I mean, they can't have decided already. Her trembling fingers worked the envelope open all the while. Lola blew a contented bubble as her mother shifted her into the security of her armpit and pulled out the cover letter. Maxwell waited. He didn't dare breathe. Lena's eyes scanned down the page. Her hand flew to her mouth. Maxwell wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Bright tears shimmered in the corners of her eyes, and he leaned in. Lena. "I got in," she whispered. "Oh my God, Maxwell, I got in." Maxwell wanted to crush her close, but there was Lola, of course. He held himself back for now and instead reached to smooth the blonde curls back from Lena's ecstatic face. "Of course you did." Mentally, he breathed a sigh of relief. Now that it was real, he knew this path was the right one. For both of them. "Congratulations, college girl." "Thank you." Lena's gratitude was so sincere, it was almost heartbreaking. "I figured it was good news. I have a gift for you," he admitted. Lena grinned up at him. "Of course you do." She looked tired, but her smile wasn't one of defeat or even of gentle exasperation. She looked ready, even eager, to see what he had in store. Maxwell hurried to his office and back. He placed the package on the bedside table. Lena leaned in quizzically, rotating the box with her free hand to face her as she cradled Lola in the other. "For you," he reiterated. "These look cool. What are they?" Lena's eyes brimmed as she sat back. "Maxwell, that's so incredibly thoughtful. Her throat closed over her thanks before she could continue, but Maxwell wasn't done yet. He produced a stack of papers from behind his back and passed them to her. "Oh my gosh, there's more?" Lena laughed, and for a moment she seemed at a loss of what to do with Lola. Maxwell set the documents on her lap and took their daughter up into his burly arms so Lena could more closely examine his last gift. He cradled Lola gently, rocking her back and forth as the diminutive life that was his daughter stirred and fussed in his arms. "What are these?" Lena leafed through the papers, eyes widening as the nature of his last gift dawned on her. "Resumes," he said. "For a nanny. I figured we could both use the help. And this way, we'll be able to steer things ourselves." His thoughts strayed to his mother and to Grandma Fudge, although he didn't say as much out loud. He and Lena were sure to get plenty of outside input in the coming years whether they asked for it or not. Maxwell thought he would probably need all the help he could get, but this way, they would have a firmer say in what went on. "Come here," Lena motioned for him. Maxwell leaned in, and she surprised him by grabbing a fistful of his shirt and dragging him down for a kiss. Both were conscious of the baby between them, and something about the three of them sharing the tender moment made it more precious than he could have possibly imagined. "Scoot over," Lena did. Resumes scattered and fell to the floor as Maxwell shifted himself carefully onto the bed beside her. He didn't bother taking off his boots. He pulled the blanket up over them as Lena turned into his side and snuggled close. She was asleep before the last resume drifted to the floor. "Mama's out," he whispered to Lola. "Just you and me now." It didn't feel that way, though. In fact, Maxwell thought, with these two handfuls of trouble permanently fixed in his life, he was sure he would never feel lonely again.